What happens when two neighboring peoples share a script, a river system, and a memory of older kingdoms, yet live in landscapes that demand different answers to the same problems? To the north, the ground lifts into hills and undulating plateaus, where winter rains feed small fields without canals. To the south, the earth flattens into a broad plain, where the soil is fertile but thirsty, and nothing grows unless the big rivers are guided by human hands. This contrast, rain on the upper Tigris versus irrigation on the lower Euphrates, shaped everything from how houses were built to how rulers imagined their power. It is the simplest way to approach the twin stories of Assyria and Babylonia, two branches of one Mesopotamian tradition that learned to live with the same water in different ways. If you stand near the old mound of Ashur on the upper Tigris, the wind feels cooler and the horizon is broken by ridges. Farmers there could count on seasonal rain to moisten the earth. They plowed small plots and watched the sky as much as the river. The Tigris ran fast and narrow, useful for transport but less gentle for flooding fields. Farther south, near Babylon, the Euphrates spread into wide meanders, and the land lay open like a page asking to be written upon with canals, dikes, and feeder channels. There, the river was not a boundary but a tool, something to be measured, redirected, and maintained as a shared project. Different water made for different work rhythms. In Assyria, sowing and reaping followed the cycle of rain, and the state could concentrate on military campaigns and overland trade during the dry months when roads were passable. In Babylonia, planning the year meant planning the water, clearing silted channels, reinforcing levees, and timing releases so barley and date palms could drink at the right moment. Both regions learned cooperation from their rivers, but Babylonia tied that cooperation to permanent institutions: canal crews, scribes who counted water rations, and temples that redistributed grain, while Assyria learned mobility and the value of guarding passes and caravan routes. Mud brick was the common answer to a shared shortage of stone and timber. From Nineveh to Uruk, walls rose from earth mixed with straw, sun-dried into units as humble as they were necessary. Builders saved fired brick for foundations, revetments, and sacred facings, because the bricks melted back into soil when neglected cities needed constant care, and a ruler's first duty often looked like maintenance. Rebuild the quay, clear the approach road, reface the temple gate, renew the city wall where the weather had bitten through. The north and south performed the same tasks, but the scale differed. In Babylonia, projects stretched along canals for miles. In Assyria, works hugged citadels and river cliffs, projecting security over a hill country that could change hands quickly. The names introduced themselves like old neighbors at a market. Ashur, the early cult center that lent its name to Assyria. Nineveh, spread on the east bank of the Tigris near a bend that made a natural harbor. Kalhu, later called Nimrud, set slightly inland where a ruler could plan a new capital from clean ground. In the south, Babylon sat on both banks of the Euphrates, linked by quays and ferries, while older cities such as Nippur, Uruk, and Ur marked the spine of an ancient, sacred geography. People knew where they were, not only by the skyline of ziggurats, but by the direction of water and the taste of the air. Wet with reeds in the marshes or dry and dusty on the steppe, trade connected these places long before either region built an empire. From the uplands, caravans carried woolen textiles, tin for bronze, and cut stone. Downstream, rafted timbers floated on inflated skins, and boats hugged canal banks loaded with barley, dates, and crafted goods. The road from the Tigris to the Euphrates was not a single line, but a web of tracks and river crossings, with way stations where animals were watered and messengers changed mounts. The north learned to look outward toward Anatolia and the Levant. The south looked both east into the Iranian highlands and down the Gulf where shells, fish, and foreign stones entered temple stores. Geography did not decide identity, but it gave each side a set of habits that later rulers would scale up into policy. Language bridged the two. After Sumerian had set the stage in the deep past, Akkadian in its Assyrian and Babylonian forms became the spoken and written medium of daily life and high administration. Cuneiform signs impressed into clay recorded grain deliveries, boundary agreements, marriage contracts, and royal triumphs. A student in a tablet house in Kalhu learned the same sign lists and proverb collections as a student in Sippur. The curriculum itself carried an idea of civilization. Knowledge is a chain you receive and pass on. This chain reduced the distance between hill and plain. An Assyrian governor could read a Babylonian survey, and a Babylonian astronomer could consult an omen list copied in the north. Clay made memory portable. Religion traveled in the same way, yet local tones remained clear. In the north, the god Ashur symbolized the community that bore his name, and later kings would speak as his weapon or his delegate. In the south, Marduk rose to prominence from a crowded pantheon and gathered the language of kingship around his temple in Babylon. Nabu, god of writing, hovered over both worlds with the same stylus-shaped prestige, while Ishtar, mistress of love and war, crossed borders without asking. Ritual calendars synchronized city life, offerings at dawn and dusk, purification at the new moon, festivals that tied agriculture to the heavens. But the meanings pointed in slightly different directions. Assyrian kings carried gods on campaign to demonstrate guardianship over land and people. Babylonian kings processed through the city during the new year to submit their office to cosmic order renewed in ritual speech. Because the north had rain, its villages could be more dispersed, and authority often grew by attaching outlying settlements to fortified centers that guarded bridges and passes. Because the south had canals, its villages strung along watercourses and looked toward canal heads, sluice gates, and temple granaries. When a ruler wanted to show power in Assyria, he might list the passes secured and the outposts provisioned. In Babylonia, he would boast of a canal cut straight as a taut rope and of fields brought under cultivation. Both projects required surveyors with measuring ropes, foremen, and record keepers, but the skills they celebrated formed different public images. The northern king as strong arm and organizer of marches, the southern king as steward of water and builder in brick. The same difference gently shaped military style. Assyria, with its long overland lines, developed a habit of moving fast, supplying armies from magazines placed along roads, and building siege equipment to take hilltop towns and walled cities abroad. Babylonia, with its open plain, faced threats that came by river or across flat country, and so invested in walls, moats, and gates that controlled bridges and ferry points. Both used chariots and later cavalry, both forged iron and bronze, and both drew on provincial levies. Yet the image that people held in their minds, of soldiers marching along a ridge under a cool sun, or of troops standing on a baked riverbank while the water level was measured for a crossing, belongs to the places themselves. Economic life followed the water, too. In Babylonia, the date palm was a keystone species. It gave fruit, shade, and building material. It tolerated salty soils, and it marked property lines along irrigation channels. Barley fields lay beyond the palms, and fish and reeds came from marsh edges. In Assyria, rain-fed grains, orchards, and animal husbandry tied households to hills and valleys. Wool from northern flocks fed textile workshops that sold finished cloth far afield. In both regions, much production passed through temples and royal estates that could mobilize labor for large tasks. Private families also held land, formed partnerships, and traded under contracts kept on clay. Work felt local, but the records reveal networks that stretched from a northern dye shop to a southern warehouse, and from there to a Gulf boat. If you ask where empire begins in this landscape, the first answer is simple. Empire begins with reliable movement. The rivers furnished north-south corridors. The roads and passes linked east and west. Messengers ran between way stations carrying small clay letters stamped with cylinder seals. Surveyors walked fields and cross-checked boundaries against earlier tablets. Priests coordinated festivals, so delegations and supplies arrived on time. In periods when political centers were weak, these routines kept going. When strong rulers took office, they did not invent new systems so much as thicken the existing ones, adding garrisons to road junctions and inspectors to canal districts. The infrastructure of daily life was the seedbed of rule. Another answer sits in the tablet houses. The scribal school was not just a classroom, it was the place where the past became useful. Students copied Sumerian hymns they no longer spoke aloud. They learned lists of cities, plants, stones, and professions. They mastered math in base 60, which fit the sky and the circle, and the shared need to divide fields and measure time. The same training turned out tax clerks, surveyors, temple administrators, and treaty drafters. It also made literature portable. A tale of a king from the south could be recopied in the north centuries later with a few dialect shifts. This is how Assyria and Babylonia, while often rivals, remained parts of one intellectual country. Because the two regions were neighbors, contact was constant. Marriages tied families across the river divide. Traders learned each other's weights and measures and kept conversion tables. When war came, it usually looked like an argument about whose officials could stand at which canal head or collect duty at which ford. When peace returned, the same officials sat together to settle arrears and write fresh agreements. Even in moments of conquest, the victor often adopted the customs, gods, and writing of the governed. Identity was not erased so much as layered. A northern ruler who held Babylon might receive a southern throne name and ritual. A southern ruler who held Nineveh would repair a temple to Ashur to show respect. The landscape taught compromise. It is easy to think that geography locks people into roles, but the record shows adaptation. Northern cities could build canals where the terrain allowed, and southern kings could campaign across mountains when the state grew strong. Rain failed, rivers shifted, marshlands expanded and retreated. Communities responded by moving quarters, re-digging channels, and renegotiating old arrangements. The durability of Mesopotamian life came from this quiet flexibility. Assyria and Babylonia were not static lists of traits, but living responses to water, trade, and memory. Their differences gave them complementary strengths that would matter when larger states formed. The earliest centuries that concern our story carry the weight of earlier achievements. Sumerian city-states had already invented much of the urban toolkit: councils, temple revenues, written contracts, and law. The great experiment of Sargon II's Akkadian Empire had shown that officials could be posted far from home to govern in the King Aegis name, and the Neo-Sumerian revival at Ur had refined administration, standardized calendars, and left behind archives to imitate. Assyria and Babylonia grew within this inheritance. They did not start from zero. They started from a crowded room of precedents. This is why their rise feels less like the birth of something new, and more like a shift in balance within a system that already knew how to run a state. As centuries turned, certain cities accumulated prestige beyond their walls. Babylon, through the elevation of Marduk and the New Year festival, came to represent a kind of universal order that later rulers ignored at their peril. Ashur symbolized the Assyrian community's right to defend and expand, and Nineveh, with its riverside palaces and gardens, came to embody imperial taste and knowledge gathering. These were not mere urban centers. They were stages on which power was explained to the public, and they offered scripts that later kings would borrow. The steward of cosmic order in the south, the executor of divine will in the north. To understand what follows, it helps to see how these scripts are grounded in water and brick rather than in grand slogans. Everyday life keeps this large picture honest. In both regions, houses clustered around courtyards, bread baked on clay ovens, and beer brewed from barley. Children learned to read by tracing wedges on broken potsherds before graduating to real tablets. Contracts named neighbors as witnesses. A lawsuit could hinge on a boundary stone or a scuffed corner where a wall had been rebuilt. People worried about rising prices when harvests were poor and celebrated when canals filled on time. The voice that comes from the tablets is not dramatic. It is steady and practical, and it reminds us that the same habits that solved household problems could scale up to solve the problems of cities and kings. When we describe Assyria and Babylonia together, we are really describing a conversation between upcountry and lowland, between rain and canal, road and river, fort and quay. The shapes of their futures are already present in this conversation. A polity comfortable with roads, passes, and rain-fed fields will, when strong, Think in lines that stretch outward and tie different regions together by movement and force. A polity comfortable with canals, levees, and redistribution will, when strong, think in networks that hold people in place with water, storage, and ritual. Each can learn from the other, and often did. Each can also push its own habits so far that it becomes a weakness. The balance shifts with climate, with trade routes, and with the kinds of leaders who rise. So the opening question, what happens when two neighbors share a culture of clay but live in different lands, finds its first answer in the ground itself. The land decides nothing alone, but it teaches. It taught the north to move and guard. It taught the south to build and manage. It taught both to write, count, and repair. Out of that teaching came two traditions that would at times merge, at times struggle, and at times stand as models for later empires. The rivers that begin in the mountains and wander to the sea are the same, but the stories they water diverge before they meet again. And now, with the lay of the land clear before us, we can watch how the early centuries after older empires gave way, set the stage for these two neighbors to step forward in turn. How do communities rebuild when a large empire falls and the center that once gave orders goes quiet? The answer in Mesopotamia, after the age of Sargon and the later kings of was not a single new power, but many hands picking up useful pieces and putting them back to work. In the north, around Ashur on the upper Tigris, towns reorganized themselves around trade that reached into Anatolia. In the south, city rulers along the Euphrates and its canals restored fields, temples, and law codes in older Sumerian forms, while new families with Amorite names rose to leadership. The period from about 2500 to 1900 BC is not a blur between famous eras. It is the quiet bridge on which two related traditions, Assyrian and Babylonian, learned the lessons they would use for centuries. When the Akkadian Empire weakened, it did not erase writing, farming, or the habits of administration that had spread with it. Governors still counted grain and animals. Scribes still taught sign lists and copied hymns. The roads and river routes were still there, and so were the markets at their junctions. What changed first was scale. Instead of inspectors sent from a distant capital, local councils and city rulers decided water schedules, collected taxes, and judged disputes. Instead of a royal army garrisoned across the land, towns guarded their own approaches and hired help as needed. The practical tasks, plowing, canal clearing, temple repair, continued almost without pause. The words on tablets show continuity. Rents, wages, deliveries, and oaths, now filed under the seal of a local lord rather than an imperial commissioner. The last great southern experiment before Babylon's rise came from the city of in what scholars call the Neo-Sumerian period. Rulers such as Ur-Nama and his son Shulgi tried to bind the old Sumerian heartland into a working unit, using clear calendars, standardized offerings, and a clean chain of officials. Their administration did not feel like lofty theory. It felt like well-kept notebooks. Warehouse ledgers recorded how much wool went in and finished cloth came out. Field surveys noted each plot's dimensions and water rights. Messengers followed fixed circuits between cities. The famous law collection associated with Ur-Nama shows the spirit of the time. Set fines in silver for injuries, protect the weak from sudden seizure, and write down the rules so that judgments could be consistent. Even when this system later broke under military pressure and drought, it left a deep groove in the region's habits. Later rulers across the plain would measure themselves against this model of orderly management. As Ur's authority faded around the start of the second millennium BC, families with Amorite names, people whose ancestors had moved in from Syria's steppe fringes, appeared more and more often in city archives. They were not strangers by the time they claimed thrones. Many served in garrisons, ran caravans, and married into local households. In cities like Isin and Larsa, and farther north at Eshnuna in the Diyala Valley and Mari on the Middle Euphrates, these dynasts took old offices and made them their own. They kept the cuneiform school, they repaired the same temples, and they issued new law collections in the spirit of the old. Lipit Ishtar of Isin, for example, set out laws that echoed Ur-Nama's arrangement, reminding subjects that justice meant predictable penalties and written norms. The South did not forget its Sumerian heritage. It curated it while power shifted from one city to another. In this same window, the North found a different kind of strength. The city of Ashur, perched above the Tigris, had long been a trading hub. Instead of conquering neighbors, its leaders cultivated roots. Donkey caravans carried fine wool textiles and tin, the metal needed to make bronze, westward and north into central Anatolia. There, in places like Kanesh, also called Nesha, the Assyrians set up merchant quarters known as karam, districts attached to local towns but governed by treaties and custom. Hundreds of letters and account tablets from Kanesh show how the system worked. Family firms spread risk by dividing shipments among different caravans. Wives in Ashur ran warehouses, advanced silver, and kept pressure on partners abroad with sharp, practical letters. Young men learned weights, measures, and price lists along with how to pack bales and handle customs duties at each pass. The route itself was carefully stitched into the landscape. From Ashur, the caravans moved northwest to the Habur Basin, then across river crossings and mountain collars, where tolls were paid to local lords who promised safe passage. At each checkpoint, officials opened sealed clay envelopes that protected the wooden tags tied to goods, read the weights declared within, and pressed their own seals to show duty paid. The karam kept a court where disputes could be heard under Assyrian law clauses built into commercial contracts. Interest rates, deadlines, and collateral were stated in clear Akkadian language. If a caravan was lost to bandits or snow, the loss was spread according to formulas that all partners knew in advance. What came back to Ashur was not just tin and silver. It was a habit of writing down expectations and enforcing them at a distance, useful tools for any state that would later govern far-flung lands. While merchants built this web, northern rulers experimented with territory. The most ambitious early figure was Shamshi-Adad, an Amorite who rose in the Upper Jazeera. He captured Ashur, installed his son there, and made his own seat at Shubat-Enlil, modern Tel Leilan, near fertile plains where rain made good harvests. From this center he coordinated a belt of towns that guarded river crossings and grain lands. His letters reveal a manager's mind. He asked for chariot teams to be kept ready, criticized a governor for letting harvest laborers idle, and checked in on canal clearing along the Kabur. He adopted the grand titles of earlier kings, but his tools were modern for his time. Messenger relays, winter grain shipments, standing garrisons, and a habit of writing daily orders. His short-lived realm taught the North another lesson. A trading city can become the core of a territorial state if it learns to feed and move soldiers without interrupting commerce. Southward, cities rivaled one another as they had in older Sumerian times. But the conditions had changed. The Euphrates and Tigris were still generous, yet their branches had shifted after centuries of use, and maintaining canals required more coordination than a single town could provide. Eson controlled Nippur for a time, and with it the ceremonial weight that came from caring for Enlil's cult. Larsa, farther south, improved fields and siphoned trade along the lower Euphrates. Eshnunna used its position in the Diyala Valley to pull goods from the east and to pressure the route north. Mari, with its palace above the river bend, watched traffic coming down from Syria and wrote letters to every court within reach. Alliances, wars, and marriages tied these places together. None created a stable empire in this phase, but their archives show steady work. Rebuilding city gates, hiring canal crews, negotiating water time, and fixing boundary markers with curses against anyone who would move them. Law kept pace with movement. The further local rulers reached, the more they wrote. Contracts from this period are careful about identity and risk. They name guarantors and witnesses and set out what will happen if a debtor flees, a caravan is delayed by snow, or a shipment of tin is found adulterated with lead. The legal formulae are not abstract ideals. They are responses to problems traders and farmers had seen. In the south, new law collections by rulers such as Lepet Ishtar and, soon after, Eshnunna's lawmakers adjusted fines, interest rates, and protections to fit current conditions. In the north, the Karam courts in Anatolia applied sets of clauses that Assyrian merchants carried in their heads and on tablets. so that a case in Kanesh could be argued with the same words that would apply at home. Scribal education made this possible. Schools taught Sumerian hymns and proverbs, even where no one spoke Sumerian in the street. Akkadian texts explained the meanings of old signs and provided bilingual word lists. Mathematical problems trained students to divide fields, compute shares, and convert between systems. The result was a shared professional language. A scribe trained in Mari could read a docket from Eshnuna and understand the weight system used by an Assyrian caravan account. This is why the period feels coherent despite political fragmentation. The cities competed, but their officials could speak to one another on clay. Temples remained large employers and storehouses. They received offerings, managed land, and lent seed grain to farmers who repaid after harvest. They also churned the economy. Wool from flocks assigned to the temple went out as rations for workers who spun and wove. Finished textiles were returned for distribution, sale, or exchange. In letters and ledgers, the gods appear as institutional owners. But the people in the rooms were priests, scribes, and workers who handled very real bales, jars, and baskets. Kings gained legitimacy by adding bricks to temple platforms, decorating gates, and endowing regular offerings. But they also gained a dependable network of warehouses and accountants who could be mobilized in times of shortage or war. The landscape outside the cities mattered, and it changed. In some years, rain failed in the north or came at the wrong time. In the south, salinization from long irrigation cycles reduced yields in older plots. Communities adjusted by shifting fields, planting more salt-tolerant barley, and opening new canals where the river had moved its bed. These slow changes pushed some groups to migrate and gave ambitious leaders excuses to intervene, claiming to repair disorder or defend trade. Yet the tone of the records remains practical. A governor in the Diyala writes that he will not deliver the expected grain because herders have driven their flocks across the fields. He asks for troops or a delay, and he proposes a new fence line. A merchant writes home that a pass is snowed in, that donkeys have died, and that he will try again in a week. A temple steward notes that the kiln failed and that the next batch of bricks must be refired. It is in these ordinary lines that we see how the period actually worked. By about 1900 BC, the shape of the next age is visible. In the north, the habit of tying markets to garrisons and garrisons to winter grain stores has created the framework for a larger Assyrian state. The rulers who followed Shamshi-Adad would inherit a toolkit that included professional scribes, messenger relays, and a sense that a capital could be moved or refounded. Ashur for tradition, or a new planned center if strategy required it. In the south, Amorite families now sat on many thrones. One of them held a modest town called Babylon. Its early rulers built walls, dug canals, and slowly gathered nearby districts. At first, they were one voice among many. Isin, Larsa, Eshnuna, and Mari still spoke loudly. But their position on the Euphrates and their willingness to adopt both Sumerian prestige and Akkadian administration set them up to matter. Between north and south stood buffer and bridge states. Mari's palace letters show how a court managed intelligence along the Euphrates, reports from outposts, lists of guest gifts, and careful tracking of who had promised what to whom. Eshnuna's kings balanced east and west, dealing with highland chiefs and steppe groups while eyeing Babylon's rise. Each of these places had its own plan. Each relied on similar tools, scribes, storehouses, and the ability to move food and men when needed. None could yet dominate the rest, which is why the archives feel busy rather than triumphant. This busy world is the world a young ruler in Babylon would soon inherit. The family firms that powered old Assyrian trade did more than earn profit. They trained a generation to think about time, risk, and evidence. A merchant's daughter in Ashur who kept the books, advanced loans, and managed disputes at the city gate understood interest, collateral, and the value of a good seal impression as well as any official. When later kings needed administrators who could run provinces honestly, they found them among such people. In the south, the habit of writing down laws and reciting them in public taught another lesson. Power must be presented as order, not whim. Later, kings would engrave their law claims on stone to be seen by all, but the custom began with clay read aloud in temple courts and marketplaces. Religion, too, adapted. Amorite rulers took Sumerian sacred titles and participated in old festivals to secure trust. In Babylon, the god Marduk's prominence grew as rulers endowed his temple and connected kingship to his favor. In Ashur, the city's god remained the symbolic head of the community, and rulers spoke of expanding for Ashur, which made conquest sound like service rather than appetite. These ways of speaking mattered because they set limits on action. A king who claimed to restore proper order had to fund temples and respect festival calendars. A ruler who said he served a city god had to protect trade and keep roads open. The words on tablets turned into obligations that subjects could measure. Across these 2 centuries, the tone of life is steady. We hear few great speeches, but we find many careful plans. When a bridge collapses, a team is assigned, and a date is set for completion. When a boundary dispute flares, elders measure from an old stone and renew the curse lines. When a caravan master dies, partners gather, tally the accounts, and decide who will continue the route. The result is that by the time stronger figures appear, the ground will take their footprints without breaking. In the north, the pattern of trade plus administration will harden into Assyrian statecraft. In the south, the pattern of law plus irrigation plus city ceremony will give Babylon a special standing that even conquerors must honor. So the question of how communities rebuilt after empire has a simple answer in this age. They rebuilt by doing ordinary things well, by writing clearly, weighing fairly, repairing canals, and teaching their children the same signs their grandparents had learned. Out of that patient work came room for wider plans. A ruler in the north could imagine more than a merchant league because the routes were reliable and the stores full. A ruler in the south could imagine more than a city alliance because water and law tied diverse quarters into one working body. The next steps, an Assyrian bid to turn networks into provinces, and a Babylonian bid to turn local stewardship into regional rule, would grow from this soil of habits that was already rich and ready. What turns a modest river town into the seat of a kingdom that others must answer to? In the case of Babylon, the change did not begin with trumpets. It began with routine work done well, clearing silt from canals, repairing walls that protected grain stores, settling lawsuits so merchants would risk their goods on the river, and balancing cult offerings so priests, farmers, and craftsmen felt that the gods were satisfied and the books were in order. When an Amorite family took Babylon's throne in the early 19th century BC, they did not inherit a grand empire. They inherited a position on a broad bend of the Euphrates with access to fields, ferries, and canals. And they inherited the southern habit of writing things down. From these materials, Hammurabi would build something larger and more durable than the power of a single city. He came to the throne around 1792 BC and ruled for more than 4 decades. The early years of his reign look local on paper, and that is the point. He ordered canal dredging to keep the barley cycle reliable. He confirmed land grants so farmers would plant without fear of later confiscation. He strengthened gates, quays, and the embankments that held the river in flood season. He sent letters to governors that read like the notes of a busy manager. Send brickmakers to this site, remit arrears from that district, correct a judge who took a gift and reverse the ruling, make sure the work gang gets its rations on time. The tone is steady and practical. A king who writes this way expects his words to change outcomes on the ground. As his base grew stronger, he watched the map. To the south, Larsa controlled large stretches of irrigated land and claimed the old authority of the Sumerian cities. To the east, Eshnunna sat astride roots from the highlands and could tax the metal and stone that lowland workshops needed. To the northwest, Mari kept a careful watch on the middle Euphrates and spoke to every court in the region through a palace chancellery that filed copies of everything. Between these centers, alliances shifted with flood levels and harvest results. Hammurabi moved first with words, then with troops. He made and broke agreements as conditions changed, and he kept a ledger of obligations he could call in when the time was right. The middle of his reign brought the decisive turn. Once Babylon's core districts were stable, he He began a sequence of campaigns that did not simply seize cities, but attached their systems to his own. When he defeated Eshnunna, he did not strip it bare. He posted officials, confirmed some local elites, and tied its revenue flows to Babylon. When he moved against Larsa and its long-lived ruler, Rim-Sin, he followed the same pattern, and the rival's ability to collect, leave fields and workshops intact, and put Babylonian calendars and quotas in place. Mari fell later, and its palace, famous for its reliefs and its archives, was neutralized as a rival center of talk and trade. What mattered was less the spectacle of victory than the careful work that followed it. New governors sworn by oath tax ledgers converted to Babylon's Counts Canal, crews retasked under Babylon's inspectors, and a stream of letters from the king pressing for results. Administration sat at the heart of this system. The palace oversaw grain and silver through a network of scribes who recorded deliveries, loans, and repayments on clay tablets kept in sealed baskets. Workers were enrolled for corvée service, short stints of state labor on canals, roads, or walls, balanced by rations in barley and oil. Officials were moved when they grew too comfortable or too close to local interests. Some orders read like an audit log. Send me the figures for the past 3 years from this temple. Explain why the canal in that district has failed. Summon the judges who let a creditor seize a debtor's plow in violation of the rule. Such letters show a king who used writing as a tool to reach into distant rooms and demand fairness where habit and pressure might tilt the scales. Religion gave this reach a shape that people recognized. In texts and ceremonies, Hammurabi presented himself as the shepherd appointed by the gods to care for the people, and above all as the servant of Marduk, Babylon's patron. The New Year festival made this visible each spring, when the king humbled himself before the god Yes statue and accepted the signs of rule as a trust, not a personal trophy. In building programs, he restored and endowed temples across the land, not just in Babylon, which allowed conquered cities to view the new order as a repair of the sacred fabric rather than a break. At the same time, he raised Marduk's status, weaving the southern pantheon around Babylon's cult in a way that matched the new political map. Many cities, one center. The most famous monument of his reign is a tall stone stele carved with an image of the king receiving authority from Shamash, the sun god and lord of justice, and engraved below with nearly 300 legal provisions. The collection is not a code in the modern sense. Judges still use discretion and custom, but it is a public statement of how justice should look in the land. It begins with a long prologue that tells why a king should write laws at all: to cause justice to be seen, to prevent the strong from harming the weak, to keep order in markets and households. The body of the text turns to cases. It sets different penalties for different social statuses, acknowledging a society where an aristocrat, a commoner, and a slave did not stand equal in court. It spells out how builders and doctors are to be paid and held liable, what happens when an ox gores a neighbor, how renters and owners divide risk after a flood, how merchants and agents settle accounts when a caravan is delayed. It tells what must be returned after a divorce, and how widows and orphans are to be protected when a father dies. It says plainly that a judge who reverses himself after taking a gift shall be fined and removed, so that others see that judgment is a duty, not a sale. This stone mattered less for the novelty of its rules. Many echo older Sumerian practice and northern custom than for the claim it made in public space. Law was no longer just a storehouse of precedents in a court. It was a visible promise engraved in hard material that stood in a temple where any visitor could trace the wedges with a finger and recite the lines. Across the territory, copies of the laws circulated on clay in schools, and their phrases entered the way scribes wrote contracts and how judges explained decisions. In this sense, Hammurabi's law was not only a set of provisions, it was a shared script for fairness that taught people what to expect from power. Economically, the regime worked by balancing central control with the energy of private households. Temple and palace estates farmed fields with large crews and turned out textiles in bulk workshops where women spun and wove under 4 women who kept their own tablets. At the same time, family firms borrowed seed grain, leased land, and hired labor for harvest, paying wages in barley, oil, and wool. Rations were calculated by age and sex. Work quotas were set in simple units. So many bricks per day, so many reeds cut, so many cubits of canal cleared. Long-distance trade continued, with Assyrian, Mariot, and Babylonian merchants adjusting routes to the new map. The state did not run every transaction, but it made sure weights and measures were standard, interest rates were known, and courts would enforce clear terms. Knowledge deepened. Astronomers tracked the moon and the planets more carefully because calendar accuracy now tied tax due dates and festival schedules across a larger area. Doctors copied diagnostic lists that linked symptoms with prognoses and treatments, a mixture of observation, herb lore, and ritual, so that care could be consistent in different cities. Mathematics in Base 60 gave surveyors and administrators a shared way to divide fields, check volumes in granaries, and calculate shares in partnerships. In the tablet houses, students copied the king's building inscriptions alongside ancient hymns, learning to tie present acts to a long past. The idea that a living ruler should be judged by how well he maintained and extended inherited order became part of how people thought. Diplomacy did not end with victories. Hammurabi kept up a thick correspondence with rulers who were sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, and sometimes both in the same year. Gifts flowed as messages with them: textiles, fine oil, metalwork, and animals that signaled goodwill. When trouble flared on a border, letters first tried to resolve it. Send back the runaways, pay the agreed duty at the ford, restrain your herders from crossing our fields before the army moved. When fighting could not be avoided, the campaign sought to control river crossings, storehouses, and the men who kept canals running, because those were the points where a map becomes a machine. The last phase of the reign shows a state that had learned to delegate without losing control. Provincial governors kept regular accounts and traveled to Babylon to present them. Inspectors from the court arrived unannounced and checked figures in situ. The king still wrote to reverse an unjust ruling, or to demand grain for a district hit by poor harvest. But the habit of rule no longer hinged on his daily presence. Roads between capitals were marked by way stations. The ferries kept schedules, and the New Year festival set a public rhythm that tied distant quarters to the center. Babylon had become a place where the idea of order, written, performed, and built, was as important as its walls. Yet the system had strains built into it. Expansion created frontiers with peoples who did not share lowland habits, and holding them required constant attention. The new balance among southern cities bred resentment that would surface when a strong hand left the scene. The labor demands of canal work and building projects could wear down goodwill if rations failed or overseers pressed too hard. Prices rose and fell with harvests. Drought in one region could ripple through the network. Hammurabi's death around 1750 BC revealed how much depended on his personal push. His son Samsu-iluna faced revolts in the south, pressure from the marshlands that became the base of the Sealand dynasty, and raids along the edges that forced the court to choose which fires to put out and which to watch. Even as territory shrank under his successors, Babylon remained what the reign had made it: a center of record-keeping, law, ritual, and learning. The stele with its laws did not lose meaning because an army withdrew. Temples continued offerings and calendars. Scribes copied the same lists and proverbs. Merchants still met at quays under standardized weights. When, decades later, a Hittite king led a fast raid down the Euphrates and sacked Babylon before turning back to his Anatolian home, the shock rearranged politics, but it did not erase the city's role. A new dynasty, the Kassites, would soon take up the crown and, rather than replace, would adopt the language, gods, and administrative habits that Hammurabi had organized, and that the land itself had shaped. So the answer to the opening question, what turns a modest town into a seat of a kingdom, is clear by the end of this long reign. It is not only conquest, it is the steady, public tying together of canals, courts, calendars, and cults, so that people in many places recognize a common order, and prefer to live within it. Hammurabi's Babylon did this in a way that others could sustain and copy. Even those who rejected Babylon's rule kept Babylon's tools. This is why later centuries would look back on his age as a measure, not because it was perfect or permanent, but because it showed that power could be built out of fairness, writing, and maintenance, as much as out of walls and spears. And with that example set, the land between the rivers was ready for a different kind of stability, under rulers who chose diplomacy and long tenure over sudden expansion. What holds a kingdom together for centuries when it does not conquer far and wide? In Babylonia, after the sharp raid that ended Hammurabi's line, the answer was patient rule by newcomers who learned the old ways and made them work. These were the Kassites, families from the eastern highlands who had served as soldiers and settlers for generations before one of their leaders took the Babylonian throne around the end of the 16th century BC. They did not try to replace what they found. They adopted the language of the land, kept the gods in their places, and rebuilt canals and walls with the same bricks as their predecessors. They called their realm Karduniash in their own tongue. But in practice, it was still Babylonia in how it spoke, worshipped, and kept its books. The surprising part is not that they ruled. It is that they did so for some 4 centuries, during which the region became a steady partner in a wider Near Eastern system that favored letters, gifts, and marriages over constant war. The new rulers started with basics. They repaired embankments along the Euphrates and Tigris, so fields would receive water at the right times. They confirmed temple lands and regular offerings, so that priests could maintain daily rites without fear of sudden cuts. They posted governors in key cities, but left local officials in place where they worked well. They built or refurbished royal residences, including a planned center called Dur-Kurigalzu, near the confluence of routes north of Babylon, where a high-stepped temple platform rose above storehouses and offices laid out on clear lines. This site shows how they thought. Make a stable seat close to canals and roads, give scribes space to count and record, and let the countryside feed the city through predictable channels. In this long period, Babylonia did not try to control the world. Instead, it joined what letters from Egypt later call a brotherhood of great kings. Egypt under the pharaohs of the new kingdom Hatti in Anatolia, Mitanni in northern Syria, and the upper Euphrates Assyria in the north and Babylonia in the south, wrote to one another in Akkadian, exchanged gifts, and sealed agreements with royal marriages. The archives at Amarna in Egypt preserve some of this traffic. A Kassite king writes to an Egyptian pharaoh as brother, asks after his health, and requests gold for a temple project, saying that gold is as common as dust in Egypt and that the shipments have been too small. An Egyptian reply sends statues, fine linen, and a princess, asking in turn for trained horses and good lapis. Behind the polite forms stand shared rules. Address equals as brothers, call lesser rulers servants, announce gifts in lists, and keep to the promises written in a previous tablet. The effect was to make distance manageable. A package sealed at Babylon could be received at Thebes, with all parties confident that the weights, the titles, and the tone were correct. Inside Babylonia, the Kassite kings used a practical tool to create loyalty and control. Land grants recorded on stones called kuduru. These boundary stones, often carved with symbols of gods across their tops and covered with cuneiform below, set out who held a field or village, what exemptions from taxes or corvée labor applied, and which officials must respect the grant. They also carried curses against anyone who moved a marker or reduced a rite, listing divine witnesses who would punish offenders. A kuduru is not just a map. It is a contract placed in a temple so that memory has a home. Copies went to the parties involved. In disputes years later, judges could read the old lines and settle where fences should run and what dues were owed. Grants rewarded service by soldiers, administrators, and sometimes whole families, and because the rules were written, the system outlived individual rulers. Horses grew more important in this era. The Kassites had a reputation for breeding and training them, and their stables served both chariot forces and the gift economy of kings. Manuals on caring for horses exist from slightly later Assyrian contexts, But the skill set was regional, and Babylonia participated in it. Donkeys still carried bulk goods, and riverboats still moved grain and timber, but horses changed the pace at which news and people could travel. Way stations along main roads kept fodder ready. Messengers with official tablets could expect help at each stop. This improved the reach of the court without the need to plant garrisons in every district. Scribal work flourished in a steady way. Lexical lists, the long word lists that pair Sumerian terms with Akkadian explanations, were copied and expanded. Scholars organized omen series on the sky, the earth, and household events, turning scattered observations into standard reference works. Astronomy advanced by patient note-taking. Scribes tracked the moon's path, recorded eclipses, and related celestial events to calendar dates useful for rituals and taxes. The sexagesimal math inherited from earlier times made it easy to divide circles and time, which fit star work as well as land survey. In medicine, diagnostic handbooks linked sets of symptoms to likely outcomes and treatments. None of this was sudden invention. It was refinement in quiet rooms, and it built a body of knowledge that later ages would borrow. Religion under the Kassites shows balance between respect and gentle change. Marduk remained the center at Babylon, and his New Year festival continued to align kingship with cosmic order. Nabu at Borsippa grew in prestige as the god of writing and wisdom, a natural match for a state that used records to rule. The Kassite rulers also introduced or raised the profile of deities dear to their own tradition, such as Shukamuna and Shumaliya, giving them shrines without displacing older cults. Building inscriptions speak in the usual language. A king restores a temple foundation, sets fine cedar doors, and provides food and oil so the god will dwell there in peace. The message is familiar to subjects who had seen many dynasties. This king builds and maintains. This king does not offend the gods. This king deserves a long reign. Economy under long rule shifted toward planned stability. Temple and palace estates held large tracts and orchards, managed flocks, and ran textile workshops, where women wove cloth in set quantities for rations and for trade. Private families leased plots, paid dues, and took loans of seed grain that were repaid after harvest. Date palms remained pillars of the southern economy, marking canals and property lines while providing fruit, wood, and fiber. Barley fields spread beyond them where water allowed. The Kuduru grants helped build a layer of landholders who, bound by written rights and duties, had reason to support the order that recognized them. Taxes were not light, but when they were predictable, households could plan. When trouble came, a flood, a silted canal, a failed rain, governors wrote to the court for relief, and exemptions could be granted for a season. Diplomacy shaped daily life in quiet but strong ways. When a foreign delegation arrived, local suppliers furnished grain, oil, cattle, and sheep, and craftsmen prepared gifts to match the standing of guests. When a Babylonian princess left for Hatti or Egypt, her dowry lists named garments, jewelry, furniture, and teams of skilled servants who would set up a household according to Babylonian standards. This export of people and practices tied courts together. It also spread styles, seal designs, furniture forms, garment cuts, across borders, so that elite rooms from Memphis to Hattusa shared a family look while remaining distinct. At the same time, border villages saw few of these refinements. There, the mark of the age was that patrols met at agreed fords, exchanged information, and returned home without raids when letters were working. The club of great powers depended on all its members staying whole. That held for a long stretch, but from the 13th century BC the balance began to change. Assyria, once a trading city with a modest belt of territory, hardened into a Middle Assyrian state with a more aggressive army and a stronger provincial system. To the west, the Hittite state reached high and then faced stresses. Egypt's reach northward shifted with each reign. Mitanni declined and disappeared as a major player. Babylonia tried to keep its role as a calm partner, but neighbors forced choices. Under a Kassite king named Kashtiliashu IV, a clash with Assyria brought defeat. The Assyrian king Tukulti-Ninurta captured Babylon, and even carried off cult statues, a heavy symbolic blow. Babylonia did not vanish, and Kassite rulers returned. But the event showed the limits of diplomacy when a strong neighbor chose force. Even so, the administrative habits built over generations worked to restore normal life after shocks. Temple offerings resumed under new kings with the same prayers as before. Canal crews returned to work. Courts took up postponed cases and read old Kuduru stones to settle revived boundary fights. The Kassite period trained the society to repair itself with written tools. A king could be captured and the court disrupted, yet the local engine, fields, shrines, and scribal offices, could restart with a new seal at the top of the tablet. This capacity mattered as the wider world grew unstable. Around 1200 BC, many regions around the eastern Mediterranean faced deep trouble. Movements of peoples by land and sea pressed borders. Trade routes broke. Some capitals were burned and not rebuilt. Scholars now call this the Late Bronze Age collapse, a label that covers many local stories. In this storm, Babylonia held on longer than several neighbors. It helped that the land could still produce grain and dates under local management, and that the court had practice in writing to rivals and avoiding unnecessary fights. But pressure mounted from the east, where Elam's kings looked westward for goods and glory, and from the north, where Assyria's rulers sought to secure their frontiers by pushing them outward. The last century of Kassite rule shows a narrowing ring. Some kings are known more from later lists than from rich archives, which suggests thinner central control. Kuduru stones continue to be carved, a sign that grants and rights still mattered, but they also hint at an effort to shore up loyalty through favors as times grew tight. When Elamite armies under a king named Shutruk-Nahunte and his heirs pushed into the lowlands near the end of the 12th century BC, they defeated Babylonian forces and carried off monuments as prizes, old stelae taken from temples along with more practical wealth. This was the sort of humiliation that courts remembered in poems and prayers. Soon after, a native dynasty based at Isin replaced the Kassites. The long Kassite chapter in Babylonian history closed not with a single event, but with a combination of losses that a tired system could not absorb. Looking back across those centuries, what did the Kassites add to the fabric they had adopted? They proved that ruling Babylonia did not demand constant conquest. They showed that care for canals, temples, and records could win consent. They embedded the practice of recording rights on durable stones and storing them where a court could find them. They kept the diplomatic language of Akkadian alive as the medium of letters among distant courts. They supported scribal projects that organized knowledge and made it available to later ages. They balanced their own traditions with those of the plain, without forcing either out. Their weaknesses are clear too. They could not stop a determined neighbor when the balance shifted, and their calm style offered few tools against sudden, sharp attacks. But for most people living in the towns and fields of the south, these were years of recognizable routines. Planting, weaving, bargaining, and bringing disputes to judges who read from tablets that looked like their grandparents' tablets. How do you govern by moving faster than problems can spread? Assyria's answer in the middle centuries of the second millennium BC was to turn a trading city with good habits into a territorial state with routines strong enough to hold distant places in line. The pieces were already on the table. Merchants who knew the roads, scribes who trusted clay more than memory, and a god whose name, Ashur, bound the community to a clear idea of duty. What changed was speed and reach. Officials and soldiers began to move on fixed routes between river crossings and hill passes. Messages moved with them, and granaries along the way made marches possible without stripping villages bare. The style was not loud, it was consistent. The first clear sign of the shift came with Ashurbanipal in the 14th century BC. He wrote to Egypt in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the day, and called himself a great king, putting Assyria into the same circle as Egypt, Hatti, and Babylonia. The wording mattered because it told neighbors and subjects that Assyria was no longer a junior partner under the older Mitanni realm in northern Syria and the upper Euphrates. On the ground, this claim showed up as posts along roads, new governors in captured towns, and a calendar of campaigns that matched the seasons. When the barley was in and the roads dried, the army moved. When rains began, forts were repaired, stores were counted, and reports were sent back to the city of Ashur. Administration grew a backbone that others could feel. The kingdom divided land into provinces, each with a governor who reported to the court. Year names tied events to time by naming each year after an eponym official, the limu of that year, which fixed dates for taxes, musters, and audits. Inspectors traveled with sealed tablets that opened at way stations where local officials added their seals. If a road collapsed or a bridge washed out, a notice went up the chain, and a work crew was assigned with a ration schedule attached. In places where irrigation could be added to rain-fed fields, small canals were cut to even out harvests. In other places, dams and check walls held spring floods long enough to water patches of land. These practical steps did not make speeches, but they made the next steps easier. The military followed the same pattern. Chariot teams and infantry formed a corps that could be assembled each year, but a growing number of soldiers served as professionals who knew the routes and the siege tools. Iron began to appear in weapons and fittings alongside bronze. Assyrian smiths were still learning to work the new metal, and much equipment remained bronze. But the change had started. Scouts went ahead to watch passes. Engineers carried picks and axes to cut roads and build ramps. Scribes recorded rations by the handful and days of service by the month. When towns resisted, the army used battering rams and ladders. When they yielded, garrisons stayed, and the work turned quiet again. Mark boundaries, count fields, and register households for labor and tax. Conquest of the Mitanni lands, known in Assyrian records as Hanigalbat, shows how the state learned to hold what it took. Under Adad Narar by Stavan and Shalmaneser I in the 13th century BC, Assyrian campaigns broke the old Mitanni network and absorbed its fertile plains around the Habur and Upper Euphrates. Rather than strip these regions, the court appointed a royal relative as a viceroy with the title King of Hanigalbat, set up provincial centers with courts and storehouses, and resettled groups inside Assyria when needed to fill labor gaps or to reduce the chance of revolt. This movement of people was not yet on the later imperial scale, but the idea was the same: shift population to where the state needs them, and record their duties in clear terms so both sides know the rules. Letters from this time have a certain tone. A governor writes that the barley harvest is late and asks permission to postpone tax deliveries by 1 month. Another reports that a border post lacks timber and requests shipments from a named district. A third warns that a nearby town has not sent its quota of workers for canal repair. The king's replies do not preach. They direct: send the timber, grant the delay but deduct it from next year's quota. Arrest the official who failed to deliver the workers and appoint one who will. The exchange is brisk, but it reveals the machine. Information flows upward, orders flow downward, and everything is recorded so that blame and credit can be assigned later without shouting. Law kept pace with rule. The Middle Assyrian laws, a collection of legal provisions from this era, set out penalties and procedures for property disputes, family matters, and crimes. Some punishments are harsh. Mutilation appears more than once, and they reflect a world where public shame and visible marks were used to deter repeat offense. But the laws also codify obligations of soldiers, standards for builders, rules for adoption and inheritance, and protections for property boundaries. They are written in short, clear cases. If this, then that. Judges use them alongside custom and written contracts. A boundary case might bring an old stone, a witness, and a tablet with a land grant. The judge would read, measure, and decide. Behind the severity in some clauses lies a state that wanted predictable outcomes and order, in households that supplied taxes and soldiers. Cities changed slowly, but the changes mattered. The old cult center of Ashur on its river bluff remained symbol and source of legitimacy. Kings restored its temple and spoke of expanding the land for Ashur, presenting each campaign as service to the god. Nineveh, farther north on the Tigris, grew as an administrative center near good fields and crossroads. Tukulti-Ninurta I, who ruled in the late 13th century BC, founded an entirely new royal city called Kar-Tukult-Ninurta, just across the river from Ashur, with a palace, temples, and a processional way. The plan shows careful thinking. Place the court within reach of the old holy city, but give it room for new offices, courts, and storehouses laid out in straight lines. It was a statement that the king's work, judging, storing, dispatching, needed its own space. Economy in these years had two main gears. One was state-directed and visible in tablets, deliveries from provinces, rations for workers, and lists of textiles turned in by workshops where women worked under overseers who counted cloth by the piece and length. The other gear was private and more scattered in the record. Leases, loans, and partnerships among families who farmed, grazed flocks, and traded in small lots. The state gear ensured secure roads, stable weights and measures, and courts that enforced contracts. The private gear kept fields tilled and markets active. The two were tied by tax and service. A family might owe a son's labor for a set number of days each year, and a share of barley and wool, but it could plan because the quotas were fixed and written. Agriculture expanded north and west into lands that had once been loosely held or raided seasonally. Assyrian officials marked new plots, counted seed grain, and assigned water rights where small canals were feasible. In rain-fed zones, they encouraged settlement by granting land on the condition that it be brought under the plow. Payments in kind, barley, wool, sheep, moved toward the centers, and in return, rations moved to garrisons and work gangs. The system could be tight. If too much was demanded, villages strained and men fled to border zones. Assyrian letters complain about such flight and order patrols to watch the roads. If a drought hit, reports begged for relief so that fields would not be abandoned. The state's success depended on these small adjustments. Craft and trade adapted to new borders. The old Assyrian link to Anatolia shifted as Assyria absorbed Hanagalbat and reached westward. Timber, stone, and metals still came from the highlands. Finished textiles and crafted goods still went out. Assyrian traders learned new markets under state protection, and foreign merchants learned the new schedule of duties at gates and ferries. Seal designs changed with tastes. Some show Hurrian elements absorbed from the Mitanni world, proof that administration can adopt local habits while enforcing central rules. The state did not try to make every room look Assyrian. It tried to make every ledger add up. Religion remained the map by which people oriented themselves. Ashur's cult gave the state its face. Ishtar in Nineveh and Arbela offered protection in war and daily life. Shamash in Sippar and other cities watched over justice. Nabu at Kalu and Borsippa mattered from their roles in writing and wisdom. Assyrian kings endowed their temples across the widened land, repaired foundations, and used these acts to show that rule meant maintenance. Festival calendars set dates for processions and offerings, tying court time to sacred time. In newly absorbed towns, restoring a local shrine was often the first step after a campaign. It calmed people and put officials and priests in the same room counting oil, grain, and animals. Assyria's style of movement brought risks alongside gains. Pushing borders outward required steady supplies and obedience in places far from the home river. Tukulti-Ninurta I's famous campaign into Babylonia, which captured the city and carried away cult statues, shows the peak of Assyrian reach in this period. From the Assyrian side, it was a victory that removed a rival and proved the army's strength. From the Babylonian side, it was a violation that later kings would work to undo. The act stirred religious feeling on both banks and created political backlash. At home, Tukulti-Ninurta built his new capital and tried to anchor his wider rule. But court tensions grew, and after years of strain, he was killed in a palace revolt. The lesson is plain. Speed and force can open doors, but keeping them open requires quiet rooms where officials trust one another. After his death, the drive slowed. Successors held much of the northern territory but faced new pressures. Groups from the Syrian steppe, known broadly as Arameans in later texts, moved across borders and rivers, seeking pasture and security. They did not always come as enemies. Many settled and paid dues, but their mobility forced Assyrian posts to watch wider zones with fewer men. At the same time, Internal struggles over succession weakened the court's grip. Provinces that had been tied closely to the center loosened. The state did not collapse, but its reach shortened. It learned that speed alone was not enough. Depth, loyal governors, content workers, and well-fed garrisons was needed to sustain a wide ring. Even in contraction, the administrative habits held. Year names continued, courts met, tablets were filed, palaces repaired flood damage, temples kept daily offerings. The schools that trained scribes kept copying omen series, math tables, and word lists. Physicians still used diagnostic handbooks. Astronomers still tracked the moon to keep calendars aligned with seasons. This continuity is easy to miss when attention goes to borders on a map, but it explains how Assyria could later surge again. The tools did not rust. They waited. If we look at daily life under this Middle Assyrian order, we see familiar rooms. In a provincial court, an official hears a case about a field boundary. Men point to an old marker and argue about a ditch that shifted in a flood. The scribe reads a land grant tablet and notes the names of witnesses. In a workshop, women count out spun thread and receive barley rations for the month. In a garrison, a messenger arrives at night with a small tablet sealed and rolled in cloth. The commander breaks the seal, reads the order, and sends a patrol at dawn. In a temple store, a clerk checks jars of oil and enters totals on a tablet to be carried to the governor ES office at week ES end. None of this is grand. All of it is how a state lives. Assyria's way of tying towns to a center differed from Babylonia's, but the two learned from each other. Assyria adopted written law forms and temple maintenance familiar in the south. Babylonia watched and sometimes copied Assyrian ways of posting governors and moving troops along roads. The competition did not erase resemblance. What marked Assyria in this era was the willingness to plant posts in other people's landscapes and teach them to run by Assyrian time. That meant couriers who knew every bend, cooks who could feed a unit from local stores without resentment, and judges who could make a decision stand in a town far from Ashur because the decision sat on a tablet with seals that all recognized. What do people do when the big routes that once felt certain begin to fray? When news arrives late, and when each city must rely a little more on its own stores and skills. In the generations after 1200 BC, towns across the Near East faced that problem in different ways. For the lands along the Tigris and Euphrates, the answer was not one grand fix, but many small ones. Officials shortened their horizons. Governors counted grain with extra care. Temples adjusted offerings to match tighter budgets, and families looked for fields closer to walls. Assyria and Babylonia did not vanish in this rough time. They contracted, shifted, and learned to manage with less reach, keeping the tools that mattered: writing, rationing, repair, so that recovery would be possible when conditions turned again. Assyria felt the change first along its western edges. The lines that earlier kings had drawn across Hanigalbat and toward the Euphrates now required more men to hold than the court could spare. Groups from the steppe, later texts call many of them Arameans, moved with herds and households, looking for water and safety. Some crossed borders peacefully and settled under treaty, paying dues and serving in labor rotations. Others came as raiders when stores were thin. Forts that once watched a single ford now scanned wider ground. Messengers rode further to warn of movement, and governors rode home to say that their patrols could not cover everything. The map that had grown in straight lines began to pull inward toward the old core on the Tigris. Inside Assyria, the state worked to balance strain with continuity. The year name system kept time in order. Taxes were still assessed by district, and courts still met to settle fields and debts. But the tone of letters changed. A governor asked to postpone delivery of barley because the road was unsafe at night. A commander reported that a bridge could not be repaired before flood season without more timber. A scribe explained that a shipment of wool was short because women in the workshop had gone to their home villages for harvest and had not returned on schedule. The king's replies remained brisk: approve the delay with a new deadline, redirect timber from a neighboring province, press the overseer to staff the workshop, but each instruction carried the weight of limited reserves. Then came a burst of energy that shows what a strong ruler could still do in a contracting world. Tiglath-pileser II, who reigned in the late 11th century BC, pushed out in all directions. He led campaigns into the highlands for timber, west to the sea for trade and display, and south to remind neighbors that Assyria still counted. He hunted lions in royal parks, refounded temples, and left inscriptions that tied his actions to Ashur's favor. He reorganized parts of the army and made the courier system more reliable by marking stages and provisioning them. For a moment, the map looked wide again, and the state's old habits, lists, stores, and roads, proved their value. But his strength showed the limits as well. After his death, succession quarrels and renewed pressure from mobile groups forced the borders to bend back. The machine ran. It simply ran on a shorter track. Babylonia faced a different set of pressures. The long Kassite chapter ended under blows from Elam and from shifting loyalties closer to home. Elamite kings crossed the lower Tigris, defeated Babylonian armies, and carried off sacred images and stelae from temples. Old stones taken as trophies along with goods and captives. The loss of Marduk's statue was not just a religious wound. It was an administrative problem, because the New Year rites that affirmed rule required the god's presence. Cities adjusted by keeping daily worship and local festivals, but reducing their reach. Governors focused on canals, levees, and seed loans. Temple kitchens trimmed offerings to match shortened larders, and scribes copied prayers that asked for the return of what had been taken. The recovery came in stages. A native dynasty based at Ison moved to reassemble the lowland under Babylon's rites and calendars. Nebuchadnezzar II, its most visible king, fought Elam and won enough to bring back Marduk's statue, an act recorded in hymns that speak more of restoration than triumph. With the cult image home, the Akitu festival could be held again in full, and the city regained its rhythm. The court used that rhythm to tighten administration. Dates for tax deliveries were set to ritual cycles. Canal crews were mustered after spring rites. Storehouse audits matched festival calendars, so that grain and oil for offerings did not compete with rations for workers. The point was simple. When money and manpower were thin, timekeeping became a tool to prevent conflict over the same jars and baskets. Even with the symbol of order restored, Babylonia lived closer to the ground. The great estates of temples and palaces continued, but more tasks fell on household units. Families leased small plots from big holders, taking loans of seed barley that they repaid at harvest. Dates from village palm groves paid dues in kind. Workshops wove cloth for rations rather than for distant trade. Judges heard more cases about fences and water times than about caravan disputes, a sign that local life weighed more than long routes. In the records, we see prices swing with harvests, and we see measures to soften shocks. Interest remissions in famine, temporary tax relief in districts hit by flood or silted channels, and communal work to recut feeder ditches when a river shifted its bed. Across both regions, writing kept institutions from falling apart. Schools did not stop. Students still copied word lists, omen series, and math tables in base 60. They learned to draw clean columns, to total rations, and to convert between measures. These skills mattered because they held the economy and law together when borders were uncertain. A court could still measure a field. A steward could still count jars and compare them to the previous month. A temple could still fix an offering schedule that matched a smaller budget. When neighbors came asking for grain or silver under old agreements, officials had records to show what had been promised and what could be paid. Clay turned memory into something usable when talk alone might fail. The roads themselves changed character. Where earlier rulers had laid out long lines of march and courier stages to hold provinces, now those same roads served short-haul needs. Way stations became granary points for local distribution. Ferries that once carried messengers between capitals now moved canal crews and tax collectors to nearby towns. This did not mean isolation. It meant that each district used its share of the system for its own balance. When a route was secure, trade flowed and families took goods to market. When it was not, people shifted to safer paths along canals or delayed shipments until patrols cleared the way. The state learned to read and react to this pulse, rather than to impose a fixed pace. Religious life absorbed the turbulence and offered a steady frame. In Assyria, Ashur's cult remained the anchor of royal speech. Kings who could not campaign far still repaired his temple, endowed offerings, and upheld festivals that claimed cosmic order. Ishtar's temples continued to serve as places where vows were made, and disputes were sworn in the goddess's name. In Babylonia, Marduk's centrality shaped how other gods were addressed. Nabu's role as patron of writing fit a time when records preserved agreements across gaps. Hymns and lamentations copied in this period reflect worry and repair, requests for healing, thanks for the return of a statue, promises to restore a gate or clean a canal. The tone is practical. Do this work and the god will dwell here. Keep this festival and the city will prosper again. Neighboring powers also shifted, which changed the choices available between the rivers. The Hittite state in Anatolia broke, and its former lands saw new small polities arise. Egypt pulled back from deep northern commitments and focused on its delta and immediate frontiers. Trade across the eastern Mediterranean faltered. Cities like Ugarit on the Syrian coast, once vibrant brokers of timber, metal, and purple dye, sent last letters that never received replies. For Assyria and Babylonia, this meant fewer foreign luxuries and less reliable distant partners. But it also meant fewer strong rivals pressing in at every point. The main pressures came from close by. Elam on the east, mobile groups on the west and southwest, and the internal problem of holding labor in fields instead of losing workers to flight. Labor policy became a fine tool in this setting. Both courts leaned more on corvée, the rotation of short-term public work in exchange for rations and tax remission. Lists of able-bodied men were kept by household and quarter. Overseers issued tokens for work completed. Rations in barley and oil were scaled by day. Failures to appear were fined. At the same time, rulers looked for ways to keep people rooted. Land grants to soldiers and officials tied families to plots. Tax exemptions for newly settled villages encouraged movement from troubled zones to safer land. Relocation still happened. Assyria continued to move groups to refill empty areas, but the tone in many texts is less about punishment and more about keeping the agricultural machine intact under stress. Law codes did not go away. They were consulted more. Middle Assyrian provisions on property and family remained a base for judges, while Babylonian practice leaned on written contracts and earlier collections that set fines and responsibilities. In a setting where strength alone could not keep a boundary, a tablet with old witnesses could. Courts arranged settlements that allowed both sides to save face. A field divided along a new ditch, a debt repaid in barley over 3 harvests, a marriage dispute resolved with a clear list of property returned. These decisions kept cases out of the streets and freed officials to focus on canals and stores. When rulers issued edicts, they were often about remission, canceling arrears, freeing debt prisoners, or resetting obligations after flood or war, measures that bought time and consent. Culture did not stop to match politics. Scholars continued to shape large series of omens, linking signs on Earth and in the sky to outcomes. Astronomers refined ways to predict lunar eclipses, which mattered for choosing ritual days, and for the court's sense of good timing. Scribes compiled standard versions of old tales and hymns, not to withdraw into the past, but to keep a shared language of meaning when daily life was narrow. In workshops, styles mixed as people moved. A seal from a border town might show motifs borrowed from old Mitanni patterns alongside Assyrian or Babylonian inscriptions. Music, utensils, and clothing show the same blend in the archaeological layers. Continuity in basic forms with small additions that came with families who resettled. By about 1000 BC, the worst of the shock had passed, and the outlines of the next age were in view. Assyria still held its core cities, Ashur, Nineveh, and the sites that would later be planned anew. Its officials still knew how to count, audit, and dispatch. Its soldiers still trained even if they marched less far. Babylonia still kept the canals running in key districts, still convened the New Year rites, and still taught its children to press neat wedges into clay. The courts had not lost their habits. The temple storehouses still logged deliveries. What was missing was not skill but surplus. It would take favorable seasons, careful leadership, and time to rebuild the depth that wide rule needs. So this period, often marked on charts as collapse, looks from the ground like reconfiguration. Lines on maps drew in, routines drew tight. Assyria learned that a fast arm must be attached to a strong body. Babylonia learned that a steady heart could beat even when limbs were bruised. Both kept the basic muscles, roads, canals, courts, schools, in working order. That is why, when new rulers later sought to push out again or to rebuild on a grand scale, they found not ruins, but systems that could be thickened. A courier station could become a provincial hub. A canal crew could become a workforce for city walls. A tablet house that had trained scribes for market ledgers could train auditors for an empire. The pause did not end the story. It preserved the skills that the next chapters would need. What happens when a state decides to take all those kept-up skills, roads, canals, courts, storehouses, schools, and push them outward year after year without pause? In Assyria after 911 BC, the answer is a steady widening of control built from patient routines rather than a single burst of glory. Adad-nirari II set the pace. He marched when the roads dried, audited when the rains came, and used winter months to count grain and men. His letters are plain. Repair this stretch of road, provision that station, move a garrison to cover a ford, send me the lists of rations issued so I can see if the numbers match. He did not try to hold everything at once. He tightened the ring around the core and then pressed outward in steps, making sure each new point had a governor, a court, a storehouse, and a schedule. From this base, his successors learned to think in routes. Tukulti-Ninurta II moved along the same ribs of the land, testing the passes that led west to the Euphrates, north to the highlands, and east into the Zagros. Each road he used became a line on the administrative map. Way stations were marked, rest days set, and stores of barley and oil placed at intervals so that an army or a courier could move without stripping villages. The habit of the old trading city now served an army. Make travel predictable. Write down what is owed at each stop, punish theft, and praise the keeper who has the store clean and the measures honest when inspectors arrive. The more predictable the road, the less force it took to make a town obey. Because people near a reliable road could sell grain, wool, and timber at known prices and get paid in full. Ashurbanipal II made the system visible. He chose a spot a short ride from Ashur and built a planned capital at Kalhu, later called Nimrud. He laid out a citadel with palaces, temples, and offices, and tied it to the river with quays and canals that kept the site fed with water and goods. He grew parks and gardens there, stocked game preserves, and carved stone reliefs that showed not only battles and hunts, but also the unglamorous work that made campaigns possible. In those scenes, men carry baskets of earth to raise ramparts, teams haul timber for siege towers, scribes tick off rations with styluses, and boats slide along canals stacked with grain jars. When he held the opening feast, the tablet that recorded it claimed that tens of thousands ate and drank for days. Even if the number is large for effect, the point stands. A court that could feed multitudes on schedule could also feed garrisons and crews as a matter of routine. Campaigning under Ashurbanipal II followed a rhythm that people in distant towns learned to read. In spring and early summer, columns moved along marked roads and river valleys toward places that had refused to pay dues or had attacked Assyrian partners. If towns resisted, he besieged them with the same techniques that appear on his reliefs: ramps, rams, and shielded archers who advanced behind movable screens. If towns yielded, he took hostages, fixed tribute in clear amounts of silver, grain, livestock, and timber, and left a governor with a small garrison and a court. He also took skilled workers, carpenters, metalworkers, stonecutters, and resettled them in places that needed labor. This was not yet the mass movement of later times, but the method is present. Break a region's ability to resist, then reorganize it so that production and dues flow. The army itself was changing shape. Chariots still mattered for display and shock, But cavalry grew in number and value because it could move fast on broken ground, chase raiders and screen marching columns. Infantry included archers, spearmen, and sappers who cut and built on command. Iron fittings and weapons appear more often, though bronze remained common. Supply lists show the practical side: barley per man per day, oil per week, leather water skins, spare bowstrings, and axes for cutting timber. Officers carried sealed tablets that authorized them to collect set amounts from each station. Station keepers added their seals when they had supplied what the tablet demanded. If a keeper fell short, his name went back to the court with a note. And an inspector might arrive unannounced at harvest time to see if shortages were due to bad weather, theft, or laziness. Provincial government thickened in step with the road net. Land beyond the core was divided into districts under officials who owed accounts each year. Eponym officials gave their names to years, which fixed time for audits and for the dismissal or promotion of governors. Courts in provincial centers copied decisions and sent summaries back to the capital. Tax quotas were written as simple tables. So much barley from this district, so much wool from that, timber from upland zones, and horses from areas known for stables. When a district could not meet its quota because of drought or flood, a governor requested relief with a proposed plan to make up the difference over the next year. The court's answer came back on clay with a seal. This paper trail gave everyone a stake in numbers that could be checked. Ashurbanipal's son, Shalmaneser III, inherited roads, stations, and habits that let him keep the pressure up for decades. He campaigned to the Euphrates again and again, crossing on boats lashed into bridges and on fords his scouts had marked. He met coalitions that formed to block him, and he recorded outcomes in lines that stressed order over drama. The enemy allied king stood, the Assyrian army advanced, tribute was set, and cities were counted as obedient. One famous meeting, at Karkar on the Orontes, brought together many Western rulers. The battle did not give Assyria a permanent hold on the coast, but it did keep routes open and forced dues. Shalmaneser's black obelisk shows envoys from many lands bringing tribute, vessels, metals, animals, and crafted goods. The scene is political, but the logic is economic. The point is to turn risk into regular payments backed by the threat of a return visit. Writing adapted to this wider world. Akkadian remained the language of royal inscriptions and many official records, but Aramaic, the common speech of merchants and travelers in the West, began to appear on dockets and as ink notes on leather and wood. Couriers could now carry a clay tablet with the formal order and a short Aramaic memo that told a station keeper what to do at a glance. Seals still mattered. A broken seal still meant trouble, but the mix of materials and scripts made the system quicker without losing form. Schools trained scribes who could switch between signs and alphabets, and who could keep lists clean in either. The goal was not beauty, it was speed with accuracy. Assyria's public face did include harsh penalties for rebellion. Inscriptions described punishments that were meant to be seen and remembered. The goal was deterrence. Make the cost of breaking treaty so clear that most towns would choose to pay, and to send hostages rather than to fight. Yet the same texts show a second track: building, repair, and care for shrines. After a campaign, the king often lists temples rebuilt, canals cleared, and gates set up with bronze bands. He presents this as service to the gods and to the people who live under them. This two-part message, firm punishment for breach and steady maintenance for compliance, made sense to subjects who wanted fields planted and markets open more than they wanted speeches. Kalhu's growth shows the domestic side of rule. The city needed more than palaces. It needed warehouses with dry floors and measured bins, scribal rooms with shelves for tablets sorted by year and by district, workshops for metal and wood, and living quarters for officials and families. It needed a quay where barges could tie up and unload grain and ashlar stone without spoilage. It needed a canal system to manage gardens and to keep low areas from turning to swamp in flood season. These projects created a kind of capital that was itself a manual for how to govern. Bring people to a center that has the right tools, teach them to work on a cycle, and send them out with clear orders and full packs. The spread of provincial centers followed the same plan on a smaller scale. In a newly organized district, the first tasks were to survey fields, reset boundary stones, measure canals, and count households. Judges took oaths from local elders and posted schedules for hearing cases. The governor met temple staff to align offerings with the district's means. A small garrison stood ready to escort tax deliveries and to help crews if a canal bank broke. When raiders tested the edges, cavalry patrols rode out and messengers ran back to the governor. If the problem was bigger than a district could handle, a tablet went up the road to the capital asking for troops, with a note on stores and fodder along the route so the column would not starve the villages it passed. Trade routes were not only lines for armies. They carried timber from the north, stone from quarries, copper and tin for bronze, and later, more iron. Caravans under private partners moved goods under the umbrella of state protection and duty schedules. When they reached gates and quays, officials weighed, assessed duty, and stamped receipts. The same road that brought a tax collector out brought a merchant in. This overlap of military and commercial routines made roads worth keeping even in years without campaigns. A village on such a road had a stake in peace and in the honest keeper of the next station, because both determined whether a flock would sell at a fair price and whether a debt would be paid on time. Assyrian kings also used image to set expectations. Reliefs on palace walls formed a public archive that anyone entering the court would see. Rows of low-relief scenes repeated the facts of rule. The king receives envoys, the army crosses a river, a town submits, a temple rises, a garden is planted, a lion is hunted in a park that is bordered by ordered trees. These images taught a simple equation. Order in the land allows order in the palace. Order in the palace ensures order in the land. They also recorded plant and animal species brought to parks and gardens from campaigns, a quiet sign that knowledge and collection went with conquest. The court was a place where new trees took root next to old ones. There were limits and strains. Long campaigns cost grain and men. Governors who lived far from the center could build their own networks and resist audits. Succession disputes at court could slow decisions and tempt rivals to test borders. The answer to each problem, in this phase, was rarely a new idea. It was more of the same methods used with care. Rotate governors before they grow too strong. Send inspectors who are not linked by marriage to local families. Keep couriers fed and mounts fresh so orders arrive before rumor. Stock frontier magazines so garrisons can stand a siege without emptying village granaries. In good years, these habits made the state feel larger than its footprint. In lean years, they kept a reduced footprint firm. Shalmaneser III's later years show the system's endurance and its fragility. He campaigned for decades, and the eponym lists tick off each year with a short note of his movements. In his last years, a powerful official at court, the Tertanu, or commander-in-chief, gathered influence and led troops in the king's name. After Shalmaneser's death, a revolt broke out, and it took his son years to restore full control. Provinces stayed mostly in line during the struggle because their daily life did not depend on a single person in the palace. Courts sat, canals were dredged, taxes were collected. But some western towns relaxed their dues, and it took renewed marches to tighten the rope again. The state learned again a lesson it had learned before. The machine works best when the center is calm and quick. Across this whole period, the look and feel of Assyrian life did not change as much as the reach did. Houses still clustered around courtyards, ovens still baked flat loaves, beer and bread still made wages real. Women in textile shops counted thread and cloth. Shepherds watched flocks and kept lists of lambs born each season. Carpenters measured beams with strings and marked the cuts with charcoal. The difference was that more of these rooms fed into offices that kept the same time and used the same weights, even when they were a week's ride apart. A judge in a western district could send a tablet to Kalhu and expect an answer in a set number of days. A storekeeper could lay out jars in rows that matched the pattern in a warehouse near Ashur, so that an inspector would feel at home in either place. If you look back from the end of this phase, the shape is clear. Assyria built a platform, roads marked and guarded, Stations supplied and audited. Governors rotated and watched. Shrines restored and tied into calendars that matched the court's year. An army that knew its paths and could climb a ramp as well as draw a bow. And a scribal class that could count, copy, and move between scripts when needed. This platform did not guarantee expansion. It did something more useful. It made expansion, when attempted by an able ruler, less likely to break the core. That is why the next generation could take the same tools, and with reforms that tightened each screw, push the borders from the mountains to seas. The groundwork, quiet, repetitive, written, was the real achievement of these years when Assyria learned to turn movement into rule and rule into routine. How do you take a working machine and make each gear smaller so it turns faster, grips tighter, and cannot be jammed by one stubborn hand? That is what Tiglath-pileser III did when he came to the Assyrian throne in 745 BC. He did not invent Assyria's tools. He resized them. He broke large provinces into smaller ones so no governor could build a private power base. He set term limits in practice by rotating officials before they took root. He turned seasonal forces into a larger standing army, supported by regular taxes and stores. He took deportation, used earlier to fill labor gaps, and made it a planned policy that moved whole groups to new lands where their skills met state needs. He tied these changes to a road and post system that moved orders and news at a pace the neighbors had not seen. The army shows these changes in the clearest way. Cavalry units grew and were trained to fight as pairs, one archer firing while the other handled the reins, then switching roles. Chariots still appeared in parades and on firm plains, but on rough ground horses did the work. Infantry ranks carried bows, spears, shields, and tools for digging and building. Supply lists became more exact, with fixed rations, spare parts, and repair kits moving with units, so that a broken lash or snapped bowstring did not halt a march. Engineers carried saws and picks to clear tracks, lay fascines over wet ground, and shape ramp approaches. Because governors now logged fodder and grain at stations in advance, the army no longer had to seize as much on the road. This reduced friction with villages and kept columns moving. Administration matched the new army in pace. Conquered territories were no longer left as allied kingdoms paying tribute under their own kings, at least not for long. They were provincialized. The court sent an Assyrian governor, a tax staff, a judicial board, and a garrison. Local laws were noted, but records were kept in Assyrian formats. Aramaic, the common tongue of merchants and villagers across the west, spread in dockets and letters alongside Akkadian, which remained the language of royal inscriptions and many formal records. This bilingual practice sped up work. A guard captain could read a short Aramaic order at a glance. The archive could keep the Akkadian tablet as the formal copy. Waitstones were checked and sealed. Measures were standardized. A receipt in a frontier town matched a receipt in the capital. Sargon II took this plan and drove it farther. He seized the throne in 722 BC and moved quickly to stabilize the core, then to reorganize the edges. When a region broke treaty, he struck hard, then rebuilt the civic frame so the area could pay and live. He founded a new capital, Dur-Sharruq-San, on a clean site north of Nineveh, laying out wide streets, a high citadel, and long walls with measured gates. Working there taught the state to plan large projects, quarry schedules, brick kilns paced by river water, carpentry shops lined with cedar from far hills, and a steady flow of rations to thousands of workers moved from many lands. When he died on campaign, the court shifted to Nineveh, but the experience of building a capital from scratch had trained officials who would feed and run an even larger city. Sennacherib, his son, put that training to work. He made Nineveh the main seat and reshaped it. He broadened streets, built a vast palace with long reliefs, and, most important for daily life, brought more water to the city. He cut channels from springs miles away and laid the famous stone aqueduct at Jerwan, with courses of dressed blocks and a clear inscription that credits the work to his reign. The water fed gardens, workshops, and baths, and it kept the city healthy in dry months. His inscriptions list campaigns across the map, including a long war in the Levant that brought him to the gates of many towns. Reliefs in his palace show the siege of Lachish in Judah in laborious detail. Siege ramps rising, battering rams butting walls, scribes counting captives and goods. The images are not dramatic so much as procedural. They show how work makes war run. Policy toward Babylon tested his government style. Early in his reign, he tried the older approach of respect and dual kingship, allowing a Babylonian ruler under Assyrian oversight. Repeated uprisings, Elamite involvement, and heavy costs led him to a hard decision in 689 BC. He razed Babylon. Canals were cut, temples broken, and the city left in ruin. From his point of view, this removed a source of rebellion near the Assyrian core. From the view of many in Assyria and across the region, the act broke a custom of honoring an ancient religious center. The backlash was deep. When Sennacherib was killed in a palace coup, many saw divine judgment. The event taught the next ruler that strength without consent can break the frame that holds an empire together. Esarhaddon reversed course. One of his first acts was to rebuild Babylon. He issued orders to clear rubble, reset foundations, and restore canals and temples with clean brick. He named himself with titles that stressed repair and mercy. He also looked west and south and planned carefully. In 671 BC, his forces took Memphis and installed rule in the Nile Delta. He handled Egypt with a mix of garrisons, agreements with local elites, and deportations of troublemakers, while sending skilled Egyptian workers to Assyrian centers and bringing Assyrian officials to the Nile to teach the routine of audits and reports. His inscriptions emphasize that he returned captured gods to their cities, built shrines, and took counsel from scholars before acting. He was not weak. He was methodical. Ashurbanipal, Esarhaddon's son, inherited both Nineveh's reach and Babylon's restored place in the order. He presented himself as a literate king who could read difficult signs and quote old texts. Under his patronage, the palace library at Nineveh grew into the largest known collection of cuneiform tablets of its age. It held omen series on the stars, livers, and births, medical handbooks with symptoms and treatments, mathematics and lexical lists, hymns and epics copied in standard forms. He ordered scribes to seek old versions in other cities, to check variants and to file duplicates. The library was not a private hobby. It was a state archive and a school for officials who needed to read the past to manage the present. Ironically, the fires that later consumed the palace baked many tablets hard and preserved them. His reign also shows the heavy cost of constant reach. He fought long wars against Elam to the east, culminating in the capture and devastation of Susa. Reliefs and texts list the dismantling of palaces and the seizure of statues and records. He campaigned in Arabia to quiet roots and to control caravans. He dealt with Egypt again when vassals wavered, sending armies to restore order. All of this kept revenue flowing and impressed distant courts, but it strained stores and men. When reports came from several fronts at once, the post system and road magazines made response possible. Yet each answer drew grain and attention away from somewhere else. The machine worked at high speed and high cost. Deportation as policy reached its clearest form in these years. Assyrian records list tens of thousands taken from one land and settled in another, with their professions noted: farmers, metal workers, weavers, chariot builders, scribes. The goal was not only to punish, it was to weaken resistance by mixing populations and to fill labor needs in planned places. A group from the mountains might be placed along a canal to learn lowland farming, while experienced irrigators from the plain were resettled near an Assyrian frontier town to raise output. Officials counted the new households, assigned land, and set rations and dues. Over time, communities blended. Aramaic spread further as a shared tongue. Local gods received shrines in new places. The empire turned movement into a tool for economy as much as for control. Inside the court, women of the royal house managed estates and could shape policy. Esarhaddon's mother, Nakia Zakutu, appears in documents as a strong figure who owned land, funded building, and issued an edict late in life that secured the succession. Queens and queen mothers oversaw workshops, textiles for rations and gifts, and religious donations that tied court and temples. Their tablets look like other administrative records: totals of wool, counts of workers, lists of gifts sent with envoys. They show how power in Assyria included domestic management scaled to empire size. Everyday life in the provinces followed the pulse the center beat. Courts met on posted days. Judges read contracts and law collections, heard witnesses, and measured fields against old stones. Temple kitchens boiled grain and brewed beer for rations and offerings. Women spun and wove in groups under overseers who checked length and weight. Shepherds recorded lambing and shearing. Tax collectors traveled with lists and sealed jars for sampling measures. In towns far from Nineveh, a governor's office filed copies of letters and sent summaries up the road each month. The sameness of these tasks across wide spaces was the point. It made distance manageable. Assyrian art recorded this sameness and its edges. Palace reliefs run like long paper films along walls. They show rivers crossed on bridges of boats, cliffs climbed with pegs and ropes, gardens planted in orderly beds watered by small rills from the new aqueducts, and animals brought from other lands to stocked parks. Lions for the hunt, deer and gazelle for display. They also show punishments for rebellion in images meant to warn. The balance is deliberate: care and severity, cultivation and force. To a visitor in the palace, the message was that the king mastered both the hard and the soft parts of rule. All these strengths masked growing fault lines. Wide borders needed many loyal governors. Even with smaller provinces, an able official could build ties that made audits hard. The army needed steady supplies. A poor harvest in one sector could ripple along the roads. Communication was fast for the time, but coups could still unfold inside the palace before outer garrisons knew. After Ashurbanipal, succession became uncertain. Brothers and cousins vied for power. Provinces waited to see who would prevail before sending full dues. In the south, Babylon's elites watched the north and kept their networks ready. To the east, new powers in the Iranian plateau organized under leaders who would soon matter more than Elam had. Still, within the span of these reigns, the empire held. It held because the road stations stayed open, because the waits at gates matched the lists, because the aqueducts delivered water to fields and workshops, because the schools produced scribes who could read a report from a distant town and know how to file it. It held because courts across the map spoke the same legal language, so a judgment in a frontier city could quote an old clause and be accepted by a visiting inspector from the capital. It held because the army did not only fight, it also built, cleared, and counted. The system's pride was not only victory over an enemy, it was a clean ledger. If you look for the idea that binds these years, it is scale-joined to routine. The reforms of Tiglath-pileser III made the parts small enough to control. Sargon II proved that new parts could be added and made to run. Sennacherib showed how engineering could feed and fix a capital that had to hold the system together. Esarhaddon reminded everyone that consent matters, and that rebuilding sacred centers wins trust. Ashurbanipal made knowledge a public good by stocking a library that taught and preserved. Together, they pushed Assyria to its widest reach, from the mountains of Iran to the edges of Egypt, from the Gulf to the Levantine coast. Yet the same plan that brought reach planted the seeds of later strain. Moving people mixed skills and cultures, but it also made memory of home into a quiet source of resistance. Smaller provinces curbed governors, but they multiplied the number of offices that could fight each other. Faster posts sped orders, but they also sped bad news. A system that counts everything depends on constant counting. When the counters falter, the machine shakes. Those tests belong to the next part of the story. For now, the empire stands on its roads and canals, its palaces and parks, its courts and schools, each running on time, each linked to the others by clay and habit. For now, the empire stands on its roads and canals, its palaces and parks, its courts and schools, each running on time, each linked to the others by clay and habit. What happens when the counting slips, when a palace quarrel slows orders by a day, and when towns that long obeyed realize they have partners beyond the horizon? The same system that carried strength across mountains could also carry weakness back toward the core. After Ashurbanipal, the court no longer spoke with one voice. Brothers and cousins disputed rank. Governors waited to see who would prevail before sending full dues. Messages still flew along the posts, but replies carried different seals within the same month. In such weather, borderlands read the wind. To the south, Babylon had lived for decades inside Assyria's frame. Its rights respected, its archives copied, its elites consulted for their skill with law and calendar. When a Chaldean leader from the marsh-fringed south, Nabopolassar, seized the Babylonian throne in 626 BC, he did not try to overturn this world at once. He used its tools. He set dates, paid rations, summoned canal crews, and wrote letters in the same clean Akkadian that Assyrian clerks used. But he also did one new thing. He let patience do the work that speed had once done for the north. He sought allies rather than swift raids. He repaired walls and courted priests. He watched the upper Tigris for a partner. That partner came from the east. The Medes, highland people organized under rulers who had been learning their own routines, saw advantage in the moment. Their king, remembered as Cyaxares, faced the same question as Nabopolassar. Could two mid-sized states do together what neither could do alone? The answer was a deliberate alliance. They moved not like a single column but like jaws closing on a map. In 614 BC, the Median army struck Ashur, the old holy city and namesake of the empire. The blow was both military and symbolic. 2 years later, in 612, the allies converged on Nineveh. The siege was long and hard. The rivers that fed the city became channels for attack as well as defense. When the walls failed, the palaces and storerooms that had once symbolized reach turned to fuel. Archives baked in the fires that consumed the rooms that housed them, preserving the tablets even as the buildings fell. Assyria did not vanish overnight. Surviving officials rallied at Haran, drew in troops, and sought help from Egypt, which wanted a buffer in the north. For a few years, fighting continued along the upper Euphrates, but the habits that had made Assyria light on its feet, rotation, strong posts, many small provinces, now made it hard for a fractured court to pull the pieces back together. In 609 BC, Haran fell, and with it the last seat of Assyrian authority. The map had a new center. Babylon and the Medes divided the old territories by line and by custom. The Medes held the highlands. Babylon took the plain and the western routes. The roads remained. The storehouses stayed where they had always been. The seals at the top of the tablets changed. If Assyria's late lesson was that speed cannot replace depth, Babylonia's early lesson in its new age was that depth can hold ground without constant march. Nabopolassar consolidated his gains not by scattering garrisons everywhere, but by knitting canal districts and temple networks into a working whole. He wrote to governors about sluices, field surveys, and boundary stones. He restored rights that anchored cities to calendars. He left a solid base to his son. Nebuchadnezzar II, who had commanded against Egypt in his father's last years, inherited a realm in order and a problem to the west. Egyptian forces still pressed up the coast and along the Euphrates, seeking to keep Levantine towns in their orbit. Nebuchadnezzar moved quickly to settle that front. At Carchemish around 605 BC, Babylonian troops met and broke Egyptian forces, a result that opened the way to steady control over Syria and the cities that lined the caravan and coastal roads. The new ruler did not simply take pledges. He learned from Assyria's attempt to govern through client kings alone. He set tribute clearly, took hostages, and adjusted garrisons to meet terrain. In stubborn places he besieged, took down gates, and set up new officials. In compliant places he confirmed local elites and let habits continue under Babylon's calendar. In Judah, repeated revolts ended with a siege of Jerusalem. The city fell. Elites were deported, not as a single punitive act but in waves across years, and resettled in the lowlands near the great rivers, where many learned new trades or applied old skills to new soils. The aim was familiar: reduce unrest where it had begun, and add to output where it could be counted. If the Western Front showed Nebuchadnezzar's grip, the capital showed his plan. He rebuilt Babylon on a scale that made administration, ritual, and daily life reinforce one another. He straightened and faced quays along the Euphrates so barges could dock in all seasons. He raised embankments and cut or recut canals that fed fields and city moats. He paved and broadened the processional way with limestone slabs and set along it walls faced with glazed bricks that carried rows of molded lions and bulls. He rebuilt the Great Northern Gate with faced brick and bronze-banded doors, the Ishtar Gate, that opened onto that road, making the line from river to temple a single measured act each new year when the statue of Marduk processed. He repaired and raised the temple tower, the staged platform known in later texts as Etemenanki, aligning it with the main temple so that the skyline taught order. These works were not only gestures, they were the skeleton of the city's economy. Water in the right place, stored and released at the right times, fed palms and barley, cooled workshops, and floated stone from far quarries. The road that bore the god also bore carts of wool and jars of oil on ordinary days. The walls that enclosed the sacred route also enclosed warehouses, markets, and courts. A city that can move a god on time can move taxes on time. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions do not shout. They list bricks and cedar, copper and gold fittings, door leaves and thresholds, canals dredged and earth hauled. The language is the same in every reign that builds well. I found the foundation old, I reset it. I made the river behave. I made the city safer and the rights cleaner. Beyond the capital, work followed the same pattern. Old cult centers, Nippur, Uruk, Sipar, or Sipa, received repairs and endowments. Governors wrote about crop forecasts and labor rotations. Temples kept daily offerings and lent seed grain to households that repaid after harvest. Workshops wove cloth at scale for rations and for export. A few private banking houses, like those later known by the family name Egibi, appear in tablets as lenders, land leasers, and partners in trade. Their records show a practical world of interest rates, collateral, and maturity dates, all said in the same steady Akkadian language that tied the city to its past. Aramaic, the easy script of the roads and markets, grew alongside, used for quick notes, labels, and day-to-day orders where speed mattered more than formal style. Scholarship took a quiet step forward in this calm. Astronomers in Babylon and nearby cities kept diaries, regular notes of sky and market together. The moon rose here, Jupiter stood there. Barley sold at this price. The river stood at that level. Over years, these lines became patterns that allowed prediction. Eclipse cycles were noted and used to set ritual days and to judge the favor of the time. Mathematics in base 60 handled the divisions of time and circle needed for such work. Medical texts were copied and organized, matching sets of symptoms to likely outcomes and treatments. Omen series, on the sky, on births, on the shapes of livers and sacrificial animals, were standardized so that scholars in different cities could consult the same line and mean the same thing. The palace did not direct each project. It kept rooms open, paid rations to temple scholars, and asked for reports when needed. Everyday life in towns under Babylonian rule looked familiar to anyone who had lived on the plain for centuries. Courtyards shaded ovens. Children learned to press wedges on potsherds before graduating to real tablets. Contracts named neighbors and witnesses and were sealed with small cylinder or stamp seals. Fields were measured with ropes. Boundaries were marked with stones inscribed with curses against anyone who would shift them. Disputes came before judges who read from law collections and contracts and adjusted fines and deadlines to match the facts. The rhythm was set by the year: sowing, irrigation, weeding, harvest, and by the month, with its religious days and market days. The New Year festival tied the court to the city and the city to the cosmos. The king knelt before the god. The god's priest struck his cheek, reminding all that rule was a trust. Nebuchadnezzar reigned 43 years. His long tenure gave his system time to mature. When he died in 562 BC, the smoothness of succession mattered more than any single project. His son Amal-Marduk held the throne briefly. Neriglissar, a powerful court figure, followed and built. His young heir did not last, and Nabonidus, A man with an unusual interest in older ruins and the moon god Sin took the crown. Nabonidus restored ancient temples with care, leaving inscriptions that read like excavation reports. He also shifted emphasis from Marduk to Sin in ways that worried the powerful priests of Babylon, and most puzzling to later readers, he spent roughly a decade away from the capital in the oasis of Tamah in northern Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to manage the core. How did this look from the ground? Calendars still turned, offerings were still made, taxes were still taken, courts still sat. But great rites that required the king's presence in person, especially at New Year, could not be performed in full. The priesthood, elite families, and many city dwellers read this as a failure to keep the cosmic contract, even as Nabonidus argued in texts that he served the gods by restoring their ancient houses precisely and by following oracles. At the edges of the realm, news arrived of a new power growing in the east. The Persians under Cyrus had taken the Median realm and then Lydia. They moved with speed, but they also wrote letters that sounded respectful to local gods and customs. They spoke a language that Mesopotamia could understand. Restore temples, keep law, pay dues. In 539 BC, the Persian advance reached the lower Tigris. There was a battle near Opis, a crossing point. Sippar yielded soon after. Babylon itself did not see a long siege. The rivers and canals that had long been the city-OS strength could also be managed by engineers who understood their habits. A Persian-led force under a general named in Babylonian sources as Ugbaru, Gubaru, entered the city without battle, a phrase that speaks to a negotiated transition, as much as to any clever tactic. Cyrus arrived after, presented himself not as a destroyer, but as the one chosen by Marduk to restore proper order, and allowed cults to resume on their calendars. His famous cylinder inscription lists cities whose gods he returned to their homes. Deported groups from earlier wars, including Jews, received permission to go back to their lands and rebuild shrines if they wished. What changed after this entry was the scale above the city, not the city's internal working. Babylon became the richest place in a larger Persian province that stretched from the Zagros to the coast. A satrap governed the region on the great king's behalf. Aramaic, already common, became the main administrative script for daily business across the empire, while Akkadian and Sumerian continued in temples and scholarly schools. Weights and measures were harmonized. Coinage spread, easing payments across distance. The road and post system that Assyria had refined and that Babylon had used became part of a royal road network that reached from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa and beyond. Couriers still changed horses at stations. Inspectors still checked their lists. Judges in Babylon still read old clauses when neighbors disputed a boundary ditch. If you walk the city in this new age, the same processional way runs straight. The Ishtar Gate still stands with its glazed rows. The quays still carry grain and stone. The ziggurat still anchors the eye. Temple kitchens still steam. Scribal schools still drill students on signs. Workshops still weave. New faces appear in markets. Men from farther west and east, soldiers with different kit. But the bargaining and measuring sound the same. Taxes go to a new capital, but the jars are weighed by the same stones. The priests write hymns for the great king that sound like older hymns with new names, joining local piety to imperial rhetoric in a way that keeps both parties at ease. The fall of Assyria and the rise of Neo-Babylon, followed by the Persian takeover, can feel like sharp turns when reduced to dates. In rooms where people counted grain and oil, they felt like changes of seal and calendar header, more than changes in the tasks themselves. Assyria taught the region how to move rule along roads. Babylon taught the region how to nest rule inside ritual and brick. Persia took both lessons, reduced friction by respecting local forms, and overlaid a wider frame that made East and West speak to one center without choking towns along the way. The result in Babylon was continuity with a broader horizon. From a distance, you might ask if anything truly ended. Assyria's capitals became mounds. Its name passed into memory as a measure and a warning. Babylon's independence ended. Its prestige did not. The clay tablets kept coming. They just filed under new regnal years. Scholars still watched the sky. Doctors still wrote symptoms. Judges still weighed a fence line against an old stone. The land between the rivers, which had learned long ago to make irrigation and law run together, now worked inside an imperial order that promised, at its best, to keep roads safe and shrines supplied. And in that promise, the next chapters of the region's story, Hellenistic plans, Parthian balances, Sasanian order, and early cities of Islam, would find an inheritance ready to be used again. What does it look like when power moves, but the streets, the markets, and the habits keep their shape? After Babylon became a rich province under Persian rule, that question turned again when Alexander the Great crossed into the region in 331 BC. He defeated the Persian king and entered Babylon, not as an enemy who burned, but as a ruler who said he admired old cities and would keep them busy. He walked its processional way, looked up at the ziggurat stump, ordered repairs, and spoke with priests and scholars who knew the sky and the calendar. He planned to make Babylon one of his main seats, then died only 8 years later in the palace the Neo-Babylonian kings had rebuilt. The plans did not vanish, but they changed hands. His generals divided the empire, and the man who took control of Mesopotamia, Seleucus, chose to build a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, downriver from Babylon, laid out with straight streets and Greek-style public spaces. How did this feel in the old city? It meant some people and offices moved to the new site where taxes were gathered and officials met, but the craft rooms and temple kitchens in Babylon still worked. Scholars still kept star diaries, priests still measured oil, boatmen still tied up at quays, judges still read contracts. The language of government across the new Seleucid realm was Greek, yet Akkadian tablets continued in temple schools for sacred matters, and Aramaic notes still passed between merchants. A Babylonian priest named Berossus even wrote a history of the land in Greek for the new rulers, translating lists of kings, flood stories, and temple lore into words a wider audience could read. The city's work became translation of language, of custom, of time, so that old rhythms could fit a new frame. The wider pattern of life shifted slowly. Hellenistic towns brought theaters, gymnasia, and new coinage. Markets began to price by stamped silver rather than only by weighed metal. Canals still marked wealth, so new rulers paid to dredge them. The Seleucid administration used the same survey skills that older courts had used: count fields, assign dues, and record exemptions. New colonies rose, Seleucia most of all, but Babylon's temples still issued loans of seed grain and took interest in barley at harvest. When a god statue needed repair, artisans from both old schools and new workshops combined skills. A Greek-trained metalworker could cast a fitting. A Babylonian stonecutter could set it under the eye of a priest who knew the ritual. This was the blend that kept the plain productive even as courthouse seals and military kit changed on the surface. Over time, power moved again. The Parthians, an Iranian people who favored a looser style of rule with many local centers, took the region in the 2nd century BC. They let Seleucia remain important and built a twin seat across the river, Ctesiphon. The two faced each other like paired lungs, drawing in caravans from east and west. Babylon, older and quieter now, still housed cult and scholarship, but its population thinned as towns shifted north. Ctesiphon grew into a capital whose great arched hall and long markets drew scribes, bankers, and artisans from every quarter. Under this rule, the state asked less for showy public works and more for steady customs. Governors in the countryside managed canals and kept patrols on river roads. City councils in Greek-founded towns managed streets and baths. Temples kept shrines working. The many layers, Greek civic forms, Aramaic market speech, Akkadian temple tablets, Iranian royal titles, coexisted because each solved a daily need. Writing changed in step with these needs. Cuneiform, never quick to write, retreated to temple schools and star lists. Aramaic and Greek scripts covered most contracts and letters. Astronomers at Babylon kept their diaries into the 1st century AD, pairing notes of moon and planet positions with barley prices and river heights, because practical life and the sky had always been linked in their method. The latest dated cuneiform texts belong to this era, showing that a 3 millennia habit faded not in a single decree, but in a gradual shift to scripts that were faster for everyday hands. The knowledge did not die with the signs. It moved into Aramaic and Greek books, into the work of scholars who traveled, taught, and copied. Religions also multiplied and learned to live side by side. Ancient Mesopotamian cults continued in some towns, though with fewer resources. Jewish communities grew in Babylon and other cities, built synagogues and built schools where teachers began discussions that would, across centuries, produce the Babylonian Talmud. Followers of new teachings from the West and East, forms of Christianity, Gnostic ideas, and later Manichaean thought, took root in neighborhoods and along caravan routes. Zoroastrianism held special place in courts east of the Tigris. Each community had its calendar, its diet rules, its courts for internal disputes. The shared space was the market and the canal bank, where measures had to match and where bridges needed repair. And so practical cooperation stayed strong even while beliefs differed. When the Sasanian house replaced the Parthians in the 3rd century AD, a sharper style of rule returned. The new kings, beginning in AD 224, favored central oversight and clear hierarchies. They made Ctesiphon the main winter capital and covered its plain with suburbs, palaces, warehouses, and barracks. They recut and extended canals, most famously the Narwan system east of the Tigris, which watered large tracts and supported grain and date harvests for the capital. They tightened provincial oversight with inspectors and regular audits. They supported Zoroastrian fire temples and priestly training, while tolerating other communities within rules that bound tax and public order. Their edicts read like older royal inscriptions in one important respect. They praised the repair of waterways and the return of fields to production, because no capital survives without food. Daily life across the province of Assyrian, as the Sasanians called much of Babylonia, again looked familiar in its essentials. Farmers sowed barley in wide basins and adjusted wooden sluice gates by hand. Date gardens were layered like green rooms, with palms above and vegetable plots below, fed by small channels. Markets sold wool, oil, fish, and fruit. Caravans brought silk and spices. Riverboats brought timber and stone. Tax collectors kept lists by village and by quarter. Judges sat in local forums and in city houses where scribes wrote in Middle Persian, Syriac, or Aramaic. The court at Ctesiphon set dues and moved troops quickly along levee-top roads. When border wars flared with Rome and later Byzantium, the capital filled with requisitions and the river with barges. But the canals still needed dredging on schedule, and the kitchens of the fire temples still needed oil. Learning moved with the times. The old cuneiform schools were gone, but observation and mathematics lived on through communities that wrote in new scripts. Astronomical ideas traveled into Greek and Syriac texts. Medical lore moved through physicians who studied in Jundishapur and other centers. Practical geometry stayed in the hands of surveyors who measured fields for tax. The habit of keeping lists, the habit of building handbooks from experience, both had ancient roots and now served new frames. When a court asked for an almanac or a calculation for a canal fall, the answer came shaped by a long memory, even if the letters on the page had changed. In the 7th century, the balance shifted again. The long war between the Sasanian and Byzantine empires weakened both. Tax burdens rose. Garrisons drained stores. Cities felt the strain. In this moment, Arab armies carrying the new message of Islam moved out from the peninsula. They met Sasanian forces in a series of battles along the Euphrates and Tigris. One, remembered at Al-Qadisiyah, opened the way to Ctesiphon. The court withdrew east. The city's storehouses and palaces changed hands. The canals and roads remained. The new rulers used the same practical tools, levies, audits, road stations, and added their own. Arabic as the language of administration, a simple coinage, and a tax system that recognized the protected status of non-Muslim communities while drawing them into a common order. What changed most quickly was the political horizon. The old capital lost its central role as the new caliphal power first chose Kufa, and then, in 762, founded Baghdad on a bend of the Tigris not far from the older sites. The choice made sense. The land had water, the rivers could bear goods, and the region's artisans, scholars, and merchants already knew how to supply a capital. The round plan of the early city set offices, mosques, and barracks in a ring. Canals fed markets. Bridges and ferries tied quarters to gardens and workshops across the river. The sciences the early caliphs encouraged, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, translation, found local friends. Aramaic and Syriac-speaking scholars carried Greek and older Near Eastern learning into Arabic. Astronomers studied the sky on a platform and wrote ephemerides that built on habits older than any dynasty. In towns beyond the new capital, the pattern of life still echoed the far past. Judges heard boundary disputes with old skills: measure, compare, and decide. Tax agents walked fields with ropes and posts. Boats moved on the same curves of water that Sumerians had cut. Palm groves still marked canals with tall shadows. Women still spun wool. Men still baked flat loaves in wall ovens. New words for officials appeared. New forms and contracts, new dates at the top of the page. But the list of tasks in a storehouse or a workshop looked like lists written on clay long before. The region had learned to store its memory in routines. You might wonder, with so many turns, what truly ended and what truly remained. The language of administration changed more than once. The names of gods and official texts changed. The shape of capital cities changed. But the basic partnership between water and writing, between fields and courts, persisted. People who lived by the Tigris and Euphrates kept the canals open because that is what keeps families alive. They kept records because that is how neighbors and rulers agree who owes what and when. When later scholars in Baghdad calculated planetary motions, they worked in a base 60 system that had been used for time and angles since the first city schools. When builders planned arches and domes, they worked with measures that fit the way wood and brick behave along a long river plain. By the early centuries of Islam, the last visible traces of old temple cults had faded, and cuneiform lived only as marks on buried tablets that no one could read. Yet the influence of the old world ran under the surface like water in a lined channel. The idea that law should be written and applied by trained judges, the habit of fixing weights and measures and of checking them with stones at gates, the expectation that rulers repair irrigation and feed a capital, the respect for calendars tied to careful observation of the sky. All these were not inventions of a single faith or crown. They were the equipment of a landscape that had taught generations to live together at scale. If you stand, in thought, on the bank where the river turns and look back, the story is not a straight line, but a braid. Assyria's drive along roads taught how to move orders and grain across distance. Babylon's care for cult and brick taught how to bind a city to a calendar and a plan. Persia layered a wide frame that left towns room to breathe. Greek and Aramaic schools taught translation across tongues. Parthian and Sasanian courts kept canals the measure of success. Early Islam built a new center that drew from all of it. In each stage, people slept under roofs, they repaired themselves, woke to the same ovens, and counted the same measures in different scripts. So, what lets a place outlast its rulers? The answer here is work done in season. Dredging a feeder ditch before weeds take it, reciting a clause before tempers rise, setting a boundary stone straight, reading a sky with calm eyes, balancing a storehouse shelf. The drama rests in the quiet success of these acts. On that quiet, powers rise and fall without breaking the thread. And when you fall asleep to this long story, what stays with you is not the shout of a victory or the fall of a wall, but the steady sound of water in a canal at night, and the scratch of a stylus on a tablet which in this land between two rivers was always the start of tomorrow. How do we know these lives and rooms so well, when the people who lived them are long gone? The answer is in the things they left that do not rot quickly, clay baked hard by chance and fire bricks stamped with name stones carved with short clean lines, and in the careful work of people who much later learned again how to read them. Fields and cities eroded. Languages shifted. But the plain between the two rivers kept its habit of recording, and that habit became a bridge across time wide enough for us to walk. The key step was simple in idea and hard in practice. Work out what the wedge marks mean. In the 19th century, scholars compared copies of royal inscriptions taken from columns and bricks in places like Nineveh and Babylon with texts found far away, especially in the highlands to the east, where Elamite kings had carried trophies home. They noticed that the same clusters of signs came with the same royal names, even when the objects were from different sites. They copied everything they could find and lined versions up side by side. They guessed values for signs and tested them against known names and numbers. It took years of repeats and corrections, but a steady trail formed from unknown marks to words that could be spoken. Once the first lists of signs and common words were drawn up, more tablets became readable. Each new reading refined the list again. This was not magic. It was patient comparison. The same kind of comparison temple scribes once used when they standardized omen series and star lists. Excavations in the mid-1800s at ancient mounds along the Tigris moved this work from theory to room-by-room detail. Teams cut trenches into high, flat-topped hills that locals knew had old walls inside. In one of those mounds near Mosul, the ruins of Nineveh appeared. Long halls lined with carved stone slabs showed scenes of hunts, sieges, river crossings, and gardens. The slabs had captions. Under fallen bricks lay rooms that had once been the royal library. There, clay tablets lay by the hundreds and then by the thousands, many broken, many still clear. Some tablets held myths and hymns known only from later retellings. Others kept medical notes, omens, and math tables like those we have described. As the signs were read, a library reassembled. The fire that had ruined the palace had baked the clay. Loss turned into preservation. Another find, made in a ruined citadel in southwestern Iran, took a famous law collection from story back to stone. A tall, dark stele covered in small, neat wedges was found there, and later recognized as the monument set up by the old Babylonian king, whose name had become a classroom label for ancient law. The stele had been carried off in war long ago and set up in a new court as a prize. The words survived because the stone had stood in the wrong city for centuries. When it was read, the tone matched the theme of justice already heard in other texts. The strong should not crush the weak. Standards of measure must be kept. Judges must be clean. Builders and doctors must be liable for their work. The particulars were from a past society with sharp lines of status. The idea that law should be public and consistent fit any age that needs strangers to trust each other. Other objects confirmed how rulers tried to speak beyond their own time. A short, barrel-shaped clay inscription from the Persian entry into Babylon set out a careful message. The new king did not come as a breaker of shrines. He came with the god's favor to restore proper rights to send displaced peoples home, if they wished, and to set damaged walls and canals in order. The lines were not long, but they used a tone this region recognized and respected. To us, the object shows how a large empire could claim legitimacy in many languages by honoring local forms. To people then, it told them what to expect at the gate and in the temple in the coming year. Archaeology also made the city plan visible in a way that texts alone could not. Survey and excavation traced out the line of Babylon's double walls, the sharp turn of the processional way as it ran through the Ishtar Gate, and the large footprint of temple and palace compounds. The quays along the river, the feeders that tied the main stream to the city's moat, and the ramps that led up to platforms, showed how water and brick worked together. When later museums mounted portions of the gate with its glazed beasts, they did more than assemble pretty walls. They showed how an urban route joined ritual to daily life, and how color and order helped set a mood of calm power that contracts and taxes then carried into rooms behind. In the countryside, maps of ancient canals drawn from old aerial photographs and satellite images, long after the first digs, filled a gap that texts often leave. Canal names appear in documents. Duties for dredging and repair are listed. But a bird's-eye view lets you see how the canals thread basins together and how feeder ditches branch off into fields. It also shows shifts, abandoned channels silted and cut by new ones, rivers that moved their beds, villages that followed the water's logic. The picture that emerges matches the tone of the records. The land was an engine that needed constant care. When care was steady, cities grew. When it faltered, taxes rose on those who remained and stores thinned. Reading private tablets, not just royal texts, brought daily voices into focus. Loan notes show seed grain taken in the 2nd month and due back in the 8th with a set interest, paid in barley. Lease tablets lay out field sizes in cords of rope length, boundary markers, and who bears risk if the canal fails. Marriage and divorce contracts list goods, return clauses, and rights in case of death. Workshop rosters set out the names of women and girls in textile rooms, their rations by age and status, and the lengths of cloth due each month. A letter from a provincial governor explains a shortage in wool deliveries after workers went home for harvest. A court record sets fines for a boundary ditch moved in a flood. None of this is grand. All of it tells how the system stayed real. Scholarly tablets add a different kind of voice, cool and persistent, tracking the sky and turning observation into prediction. Diaries pair notes on the moon, planets, and eclipses with readings of river height and prices, because timing in heaven and on earth both fed decisions. Over time, these notes led to mathematical schemes that allowed a learned scribe to say, months ahead, when a lunar eclipse might occur. The purpose was ritual and omen, but the result was a set of tools useful to any culture that watches the sky. These methods pass forward through translation and teaching. They do not care which court pays the rations. Not every finding is neat. Many rooms were robbed for brick and stone in later ages. Inscriptions are broken just where a date or a name should sit. City layers have been cut by later building again and again. The plain floods and buries what it made. Political conflict in the modern era has stopped work or damaged sites. Even so, enough remains to draw a picture that hangs together and can be checked against itself. A broken panel in a palace can be matched to another panel long since removed. A tablet dug in one place can be joined to its missing half found decades earlier in another collection. Work goes on in many languages under many flags, but the method of patient match and cautious claim binds it. You can see too how ideas travel without inscriptions. The base 60 system is a good example. It appears first in the way early city accountants divided grain and measured plots. It persists in star calculation, where angles and time slice well into 60s. It moves into later science, where hours and degrees still carry the old counts. No proclamation fixed it in law across empires. People kept it because it worked, and because schools taught it to new hands who found it natural. The same is true for repair as a royal duty. Every power that lasted in this land soon learned to praise canal work, and to measure rains by fields brought back into use. That value did not need a library, it needed a harvest. The moral notes in the oldest royal texts stay steady too. Kings habitually claim they protected widows and orphans, stopped the strong from abusing the weak, and removed corrupt judges. They say this whether they ruled one city or an empire. The claims tell us as much about expectation as about fact. People in towns and fields across ages wanted rulers to keep markets fair, courts honest, weights true, and water steady. When that happened, loyalty held. When it slipped, patience thinned. The late Assyrian story and the late Babylonian story both show the limit. Reach fails when consent erodes. The Persian entry shows the repair. Trust returns when forms and calendars are respected, and the daily frame stays intact. Modern cities on the plain keep this measure. Dams and barrages now manage floods that older kings faced with levees and cuts, but the principle is the same. Water has to be where people need it when they need it. The legal systems that govern those cities are not copies of ancient codes. Yet the idea that published law should bind judges and that standards should be checked is familiar. In schools far from the rivers, children learn to count minutes and degrees and never need to know why the numbers come in 60s. The past sits under their hands anyway. This is not romantic. It is the way habits last when they make life easier. There is a final kind of knowledge that excavations give, and it is quiet. When you stand in a cleared street line at an old site, you see the width of daily traffic and the closeness of walls. Courtyards were not large. Ovens sat near doorways where breezes could carry heat away. Drains ran under thresholds toward lanes. A fragment of a toy, a spindle whorl, a lump of vitrified glaze, a jar stopper. These are small, but they make the rooms real. A palace relief can show a siege ramp. A tablet can set a fine for moving a marker. A jar stopper with a careful thumbprint brings home the touch of a person you would have passed without notice if you had shared that street. This level of contact is not dramatic, yet it builds the calm knowledge that most lives then, as now, were steady, careful, and full of tasks whose success made the famous acts possible. So, the story you have heard, Assyria's long reach built from roads and posts, Babylon's deep order built from bricks and rites, Persia's wide frame that left local rooms to work later, blends that kept markets and canals moving, does not end in one date because it never depended on one date. It rests on built routines and shared expectations that can survive new names at the top of a tablet. When we recover those routines from clay and stone and the ground's memory, we do not only look back, we check our own frames for the same strengths and faults. Are weights true? Are courts clean? Are the channels open? Do calendars serve both right and work? Can a rule be read and understood by someone who did not write it? If you fall asleep now with this in mind, the sounds that return are the same ones people trusted then. A sluice board shifts, water moves, a worker calls a count in a workshop, and a second voice answers with the total. A clerk taps a stylus against a jar rim to settle clay before pressing a seal. A judge repeats a clause so both sides hear it. A child recites a sign list. An astronomer notes the moon as rise against a wall corner and adds the price of barley to the same line. These are not loud sounds. They are steady. They held empires up and let cities heal when empires fell. And they are what make the story of Assyria and Babylon feel close even now. Work done at the right time in the right measure, written down so neighbors and strangers can agree, and carried forward, so tomorrow has a plan before the sun clears the river mist. If you carry one thought with you as you close your eyes, let it be this simple one. People here learned to turn water and words into steady life. They cut channels, set schedules, wrote rules, and checked weights so that strangers could trade and neighbors could live side by side. Kings and courts changed. Cities rose, shrank, and rose again. Scripts shifted from wedges to letters. Yet the same quiet habits kept things working. Repair the ditch before the flood. Read the clause before the dispute. Open the gate on time. Weigh the jar with a true stone. That is why their story feels familiar even now. It is not the voice of one conqueror or one monument. It is the low, constant sound of work done in season and recorded so that tomorrow will know what today agreed. If you think back on the long path we followed, through Assyrian roads and posts, through Babylonian bricks and rites, through Persian frames and later blends, you can see that the strongest legacy is not a wall or a tower. It is a way of tying people together with routines that outlast names. A calendar that keeps harvest and festival in balance. A court that reads the same line the same way in 2 towns a week apart. A canal that carries water to fields and boats to market. These are small things, but many small things kept well become a civilization. When they falter, great powers stumble. When they hold, new rulers find a ready base and old cities learn to breathe again. So as you drift off, picture a canal at dusk and a scribe's bench near a doorway. The board lifts, water moves, a stylus presses a last smooth line into clay. A judge repeats a decision so both sides hear it. A child recites signs under a soft lamp. A boat slides along the bank toward a quiet quay. Nothing here needs a speech. Nothing here asks for drama. It asks only for care, for time kept, for work noted and shared. That is the thread that runs from the first settlements on the plain to the libraries and courts that came after. And it is the thread that makes the story of Assyria and Babylon a calm place to rest. Let the river keep its course. Let the tablet dry by the hearth. And let sleep come with the comfort that order can be made, kept, and handed on.